Thanks, Simon. Good evening, everyone. It's just turned evening. The sun's about to set here in Sydney, and I'm sure in Newcastle too. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's VA&E with Simon Oudiette. Give me one sec, sorry. Someone's set the transcription on and it drives me nuts. Give me one sec. There we go. That's much easier for me. All right, so thanks everyone for joining us. 5 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon for the last VA&E of the semester, organised in for the Masters studios. And it's with great pleasure that I'm able to welcome my very dear friend, Simon Oudiette, to come and speak with us this afternoon. As you know, the VA&E is this incredible opportunity that the University of Newcastle School of Architecture and Built Environment organises to allow us to bring in special guests, experts in their fields from Australia and around the world, to give us talks and run workshops, ultimately to kind of expand the discussion within the school and to introduce new ways of working, which is exactly why we're here tonight. Simon, as I said, is a good friend of mine. We met when he was living in Sydney back in 2012, and we've known each other ever since. Simon is the founder of Haroma Studio, a one-person boutique visual communication consultancy currently based in Barcelona, in Spain. Simon trained as an architect first in Strasbourg, France, and spent some time studying in Sydney. He has worked with offices in Paris and Sydney as an architectural graduate prior to establishing his visualization company, Haroma. Haroma was established with the double goal of producing amazing, enticing images for architecture firms, as well as sharing knowledge with the architectural visualization community through blog posts and videos. Simon creates visualizations for architecture offices across Europe, having worked with some of the more interesting design practices in places like Belgium, France, and Spain. He's recently completed and released a comprehensive online course in conjunction with Chaos Group V-Ray on the topic of composition, and that's the topic that I wanted him to speak with us tonight. He has the goal of strengthening the understanding of the fundamentals of image crafting for aspiring visualization artists and artists alike, bringing together theory and practice in that curriculum. Simon's going to be talking to us about how composition and visualization techniques can assist us as designers. Something that we don't often think about is that relationship between communication, representation, and design. So I'm really looking forward to the presentation today. We're going to start with a presentation from Simon of his work, and then we're going to get into a workshop where everyone will be able to kind of work on their own projects, whether they're past images or current ones you're working on, with the aim that you'll be able to use these in your final presentations in a week and a half or 2 weeks time from now. So Simon, thank you again for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Justin, for the very nice introduction. I'll try to share my screen as usual. I suck at using Zoom. I think if I do this, it should work. Yep.
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
So, well, I'll do, like, as Justin said, like a very quick introduction to my work, etc. And then I'll try to go on to like more interesting stuff regarding the actual work that I'm doing regarding like composition and how could be potentially useful even for architecture graduate or aspiring graduate rather than only ArcVis people. So let's start. So a short introduction about me. So as Justin said, I studied in Strasbourg from like 2009 to 2014. It's a pretty city if you want to visit it someday. It's very interesting because what was the main problem I had with this when I was back at school there is that we had a very disorganized way of working. And it's always the way I felt about like studying architecture is that everything seems sort of like not following a workflow or sort of logic that is like kind of not, let's say, biased, but something that would be easily applicable. And usually you have your tutors saying like, this works, this doesn't, but they never explain why. And this was like sort of an issue I had back at the time. As Justin mentioned, I went to university as an exchange student.
Sorry, Simon. Just to interrupt. Are you still on the title slide, or have you moved ahead?
Oh shit! Sorry.
Because we can only see the title slide.
Yeah. I'm not on the right thing here. This should move. Yes. Sorry.
Perfect. Yes. There we go.
As I said, I'm not that good at presenting online. So Strasbourg, pretty interesting. A lot of food for thought before leaving. When I went to study in Sydney, I had like the pleasure of like actually meeting Justin, which had like a completely different way of working, and also like just experiencing the completely different mindset that Australia seemed to have, at least in the university aspect. And there was like all this talk about like theory and image, which was something that was completely absent in architecture in France. So this gave me like already quite a lot to think about. And when I get back to France, I did my graduation project, which was like a fairly interesting thing because I was like already what we tried to do in France at least is to like merge the thesis work that we do with the actual graduation project. And so I did mine on like heritage study and how we can sort of like just questioning the way we deal with heritage, because in France we have like a very conservative way of dealing with it. When I was in Sydney, I noticed that there were like some sort of like a more openness to having like more daring design. And so the whole topic of the thesis and the project was just to sort of like not necessarily make a feasible project, as you can see from the renderings, but to actually just sort of question what are the limits of what we can do with heritage and how like we can make like more buildings that are more like not user friendly, but a bit more like done by the people rather than done by like a sort of top down version. Anyway, right after that, since I was like still very into the idea of theory and making images, I was working on many competitions, either alone or with friends. And what is like more motivating is when you win like most of them. So some of them were like actually pretty good competitions, and other were like more like unknown back then. But like for instance, the 24-hour competition like back then was like maybe the third or fourth edition, and now they're like pretty decent and established competition in Europe. And so like all this was always like driving this sort of interest of like how can you represent ideas, and how can you like sort of have a more organized way of working. One reason I went to ArcVis, because as Justin mentioned, is like I did work for a couple of years in several like firms as an architect, but I never really liked it, and there was like many reasons. And the reasons I sort of went to ArcVis quite quickly was there was like a lot of so the pros is like this idea of time frame, where like when you work in ArcVis, what is interesting is that you have like much shorter time frame, because you're basically dealing with the last 2 weeks of any project that clients are working on. So you'll be basically I mainly work on competitions. So it's basically, usually 10 days is like a decent normal contract. And what is interesting is that you'll just like have that one after another. So it's very tiring, it's very intense, but at the same time, you have like an interesting time frame to work with. Because I remember back when I was working in some architecture firm, seeing like friends or like colleagues working on the same project for several years on, and I was like, I really can't do that. Another thing that is interesting as well was this idea of like diversity, and this term of like the type of programs that you will be working on. So you like lately I work a lot on like office in schools, but I made like museums, airports, and like there's a completely different or like very large span of the type of subject you can deal with, which is very interesting because when you're actually working in an architecture firm, it's something that is very complicated to get your hands on, to have like this sort of diversity. So that was quite nice. Also, just in terms of freedom, like regarding working hours and working remotely, etc. Even though back then working remotely was not that common, but it was still nice touch, because the thing is like I like traveling. So even though it's not the easiest to travel with your workstation, you can still like sort of I moved around France. I lived in Spain. I'm living now in Spain. I moved to Bulgaria at some point. So there's like a lot of things going on, but I could keep my clients in different locations as well, which was quite nice. And also in terms of flexibility and learning curve, like this idea of all the free time that you have, you can dedicate it to actually experiment with actual projects, which is quite nice. Because I remember when I was working in architecture, there's like you're dedicating so much time to the actual project you're working on that you don't have that much time to actually work on other projects. And this is what I was interested in as well, is like how kind of frustrating it was like not to be able to grow if you couldn't like learn and like read and look at stuff and take the time to actually do it. So this is what I sort of like led me to it. One thing that I did before, like I did start my company right after I graduated, but I did go for a whole year to a Parisian firm called TVK or TVK, which is like it's a young Parisian firm, and they have like they were basically looking for like someone to do their ArcVis stuff, but also to have someone doing their sort of like branding or visual identity, which was quite interesting. The thing though is that I thought I would be like joining a sort of team, and in the end, I was actually the only guy doing the visualization. So I had to learn quite a bit of stuff very quickly. But this is kind of like the thing that sort of set you on the path and on the pace that architecture is, in the sense that you just have to be very efficient very quickly, which was quite just a good thing to learn at the very beginning of my career, if I may say. And so in 2014 or 2015, I started Horoma. So this is like, as I said, the sort of studio that I'm running. One thing that I like to say, even though it's just for the joke, if I may say, it's like 100% organic growth. It's like this idea that I don't know if it stems from the fact that I'm extremely lazy or from the fact that I do believe that it's better, but it's just this idea of I never market anything. All my clients are like referrals, people that I know, people that refer to other clients. And this is how I managed to grow like my pool of clients over the years. And even though like I do have like very, how can I say, like established firms, like locally have like more international ones. But I do have like this idea of like really fostering like long relationship with business, because sometimes you have like this idea of like just doing like one-offs and you just like change your client all the time. But when you're actually not marketing and you can't really get new clients very quickly, you actually have to make sure that you work properly. And one thing that is nice is that once you start having a much deeper relationship with your clients, you can actually start asking them more stuff regarding the actual visualization aspect and how they see it. So that in the end, I managed to keep a sort of foot in the architecture world, as in like how they see it, rather than just being completely focused on visualization. Over the past 6 to 7 years, I've worked on like, I'm not even sure those numbers are actually accurate, but it's like, yeah, around 200 projects. So as I said, it's like something that is very fun, because I don't think there are many like architects that manage to work on 200 jobs on like the last 6 to 7 years. So it's like, it helps in really building this sort of like references and knowledge about like how you can deal with future projects in the end. And so like commission visuals, etc. So this is like, just to give you a sort of rough idea, because here it's like 500 visuals over like, let's say 7 years, which is like around 70 images per year, something like that. But the thing is that they're crammed in really, that's the only thing, I guess, if I were to say like a drawback about visualization, is that the rhythm is very, especially when you don't market yourself, at least actively, is that you will have like maybe 3-4 projects on 1 month, then just a single project after, or even like 6 or 7 projects at once. And you're dealing with like a lot of ups and downs, which is kind of hard to deal with sometimes, but it's on the other hand, it sort of like helps to sort of like merge and mesh like knowledge by using different projects that you're working on at the same time in order to feed your creativity, if I may say. One thing that is very important, I think, and that I was sort of mentioning, is this idea of like having free time to be able to do other stuff and at least still related to work and like do your own project, your own research, your own visuals, just to explore like new ideas and make like different stuff. And also nowadays I do have like client work on my website, but back then I was only focusing on displaying what are the stuff I like to do. So it was like mainly personal projects, so that the clients would be sort of seeing already what were the type of visuals I would like to do rather than the type of visuals they would like to have, and sort of like start this conversation about what could be done together. And a while ago, I first started doing like blog posts and articles about like ArcViz in general and tutorials that got like, some of them got pretty like decent exposure with like many people talking about like scripts and stuff that I did. And maybe a couple of years ago, I started something called like rendering teardowns, which was like basically starting doing critics for, actually they were like, it was mainly oriented towards like freelancers that were doing ArcViz, because they sort of need this idea of having feedback, because when you're working alone, it's very hard to get like feedback on your own work. But I actually also got like many submissions from architecture students that were like actually submitting their final graduation work or like whatever project they were working on. And they wanted to have like a little bit more like deeper feedback on what they were actually working on. This sort of like led me to this idea of like teaching, even though I'm like not really into the, I don't know why I have a problem with the word, but whatever. And the thing is that it was mostly sort of like emerging from a sort of lack on the market that I noticed, where everybody was like focusing more on tutorials rather than like the actual fundamentals of what it is to make an image. So most of the focus I was doing regarding my work is like on how to explain what are the actual fundamentals. So basically like composition and stuff like this, and also try to go like much deeper, because composition is like a word you will hear all the time about like image making, or even like maybe a bit less about architecture, even though this whole presentation is to show you that it actually applies quite seamlessly. This idea that yeah, they would like be very shallow on like what composition is. And the whole thing is that I spent like maybe the last 3 years working on this topic, like really quite actively, like almost all, not all of my free time, but I mean all the free time I dedicate to additional work was dedicated to sort of like understanding more this subject, and then to sort of like reverse engineer it to sort of be able to teach it, because it's a completely different thing to understand the topic and to actually be able to teach it and explain it. So hopefully I'll do a decent job at it today so that you learn some things. And one thing also that I was always kind of starting from is this idea of common misconceptions, because there's like a lot of topics where we have like heuristics where we think like, yeah, this topic or this thing just means this. And actually when you dig a little bit deeper, you see that most of it is actually not really true, or it's either wrong or like so simplified that you can't actually use it. And so, and this idea of, yeah, asking why rather than how, because as I was saying, is like people are always like after tutorials and like how to do things rather than understanding why they should do that thing in the first place. So the whole presentation that I want to do today is to sort of like help you asking why and understand like how it sort of impacts the way you can design. So yeah, to this presentation, image equal project. So this is kind of the whole idea, I think, behind the presentation. It's a sort of lapsus that I often make when I'm talking with clients. Is like we talk about image and then I talk about project and vice versa. And it really is this idea that actually there's a really seamless continuity between when you start a project or start even thinking about a project, design it, and then visualize it or make like illustration of it. And I had this sort of sense of this continuity and the fact that everything has to be a sort of a whole that makes sense. Because sometimes you have like the illustration that's just slapped at the end, or very, how can you say, so constrained by like the jury and the regulation and whatever, like the organization of the competition, that sometimes it sort of misses the point of what the project was about. So it was kind of also stemming from that origin. And so the three main points I'd say but this presentation will be about like understanding the basics of composition. So I might go super fast. How can I say? Like it's a super deep subject. Like literally, the course I'm doing is like more than 60 hours. But so like sort of compacting it in 40 minutes is not super ideal. But I sort of took like 2 or 3 main ideas that I think are already easily translatable into architecture and visualization, so that you can actually already like use it in what we'll do in the workshop, hopefully, and in what we can do and what you will do in your future projects. Also, this idea of like rationalizing the decision process for design illustration, as I was saying, is like this idea of how can you actually take proper decision rather than just like randomly choose one design between other options without being able to actually explain why. And finally, this idea of clarifying communication, because I think this is one of the main things that helps. When I was talking about that back in the course that I do, it's more about this idea of like being able to communicate with your client. But as architecture is more of a like collaborative environment, there's also this idea of being able to talk with your peers about the projects, but at a sort of like higher level where you're not just like stating your opinion, but actually explaining what really is going on. Because there are like, as I'll try to show you and explain, there are like some sort of unbiased aspect to composition that you can use very easily. And the overall structure of like what we're about to do is, so yeah, as I was saying, like theory of composition, then a very quick case study just to explain you the sort of like overall idea of what I think could be interesting for us to work on. And then we'll have like, the workshop is in like 2 quick parts, where the idea is to sort of question your architectural design using composition principles that I will have explained, and then question visualization using composition principles. So this is like the 2-step. The first step will be quite quick because it's more the architectural side. So not that I mean, I'm definitely not an expert in that. It's just that it sort of applies. So I want to show you how you can sort of use it. And more on the visualization aspect, that will be much more extensive, and hopefully we have time to do like proper feedback sessions on your work. So just need water. Sorry. So fundamentals of composition. So yeah, rethinking composition. As I was saying, so I've been practicing for like 6-7 years and thinking about this topic for like about at least a good 3 years. And one thing that I tend to do is like something I heard actually from a Jimmy Nestle, conference, where I was talking about this idea of misreading quotes. And I tend to do that a lot, where I will like, when I put together the course, I was reading books about like very wide range of topics that stem from like, or ranges starting or spans from like basically photography, which is what everybody reads about, to like more like psychology, Gestalt psychology, image theory, or more like paintings and stuff like that, and read like how were like the masters working, etc. So it's like a wider range, or even like more like completely more like philosophical and it's like highly theoretical stuff that from the get-go, or like from the like first glance at it, it would be like, yeah, this is definitely not applicable. And actually by this idea of like not really misreading, but like over analyzing something, you tend to sort of find ways you can use stuff. So I'm just going to throw at you like 3 different quotes that I've chose for the course that will help me in sort of structuring the idea. First one is like a very short quote from Henri Cartier-Bresson, who's like a French photographer that is pretty like from the 20th century. He's quite famous, and he has this idea of like, you can't separate form from substance. So something we'll get back to on like this idea of intent and how you really need to question why you're doing something. Another thing, quote that I quite like, is this idea of our experience of an architectural space is strongly influenced by how we arrive in it, by Matthew Frederick. And this is, it was kind of like, I read it from a completely, I don't want to say random book, because that would be maybe a little bit disrespectful, but like I read it like, I think it's from like 101 architecture stuff I learned in university or something like this. It's poorly explained title, but like it was mostly focused on architecture. And the thing is that there's a whole idea that is like entirely translatable into how you enter an image, and like the things are like quite like matching in a way. And the third one is a quote by John Ruskin: "Every touch of paint creates a new canvas," which is something related more to contrast and balance that I will have a look at after and try to explain to you. So as I said earlier, like I like to work from like common misconceptions, and the main ones, also here I've like listed just a couple, but like I could literally come up with like 60 of those if I wanted. It's this idea of like, I was asking actually my students when I started, like, what do you think composition is? And most of the people would actually always mention rules, and rather than like the actual concept itself. So we talk about the rule of thirds, the idea of framing, the idea of like having a focal point or using another like a grid system like the golden ratio, the golden triangle, or like dynamic symmetry and stuff like this. And well, the thing is, like, for me, it was, as I said, it's like this idea of frustration of not being able to understand why you would use something. Because if composition is the rule of thirds, then but why do we use the rule of thirds? And when you start questioning what is the rule of thirds, like historically, you discover that it's like something that is so simplified and so like out of the context and that like not that powerful in like understanding the concept that you're like, there must be something else behind it. So I had this sort of former idea at the very beginning that like composition would be, there's two things to understand, I think, that is very important, is this idea that composition is not a step-by-step process. It's more like a sort of interlinkage between, or like a Venn diagram between concepts. And at first what I was looking at is this idea of like quite basic of like light, frame, and color. So basically you have to sort of organize those three concepts in order to be able to make an image that works. And then, like, as I was saying, is like I felt like something was missing. And this is where the quote from Henri Cartier-Bresson comes into play, where like this idea of you can't separate form from substance. And here substance is to be understood as like meaning. And like when he was talking about this, it was talking about like taking photographs, and this idea that you literally can't take a photograph if you don't know what you're trying to shoot. So this came like helped me in like having like this slightly more understandable diagram with the idea of like what he calls like substance, I call intent. It's something that I learned from Michael Freeman, who's like a photographer. And the idea of intent, I'll explain it a bit, but it's basically this sort of like solves many issues in understanding how you can actually make those interlinkages work. And so you end up with a sort of a new definition, if I may say, that, or at least that's the one I came up with, that sort of like embodies and sort of gathers all those concepts. And composition would be the careful curating of elements, colors, and lights in the frame to create a specific reaction in the eye of the viewer. So the idea of curating elements is like this sort of like frame where basically everything that is within the frame is like, since you're like building things from scratch, you sort of like have to choose what is inside and what is outside the frame. The idea of curating colors as well is because we won't have time to cover that, but like color theory is something extremely powerful in the sense that there's a lot of let's say relativity in the way you perceive colors. So it means that they're very malleable. And the same is with light, is like you can actually play a lot with light and make it work the way you want in order to lead the eye in the frame, etc. And one of the important aspects is also this idea of creating a specific reaction in the eye of the viewer, or which is like this idea of intent, is like you can't compose an image if you don't know what you're trying to achieve in terms of goal, basically, or intent. Composition principles apply to everybody because they're based on human perception of elements. This is also one of the important aspects, I think, is that we tend to think that like composition principles don't necessarily apply all the time. But the thing is that we literally theorized composition around the human perception. So it means that it applies all the time because we're like constantly perceiving things. We're constantly perceiving space, constantly perceiving images, etc. And what I'll do is like explain to you a couple of concepts or like very broad ideas that you can use. And then you'll see that, hopefully you'll see that there's like a very easy understanding on how it applies to 3D spaces and how you experience space in a sort of like sensory way, and how you also experience space through simple 2D images like renderings and illustrations in general. One thing also that bears repeating and maybe explaining is this idea of why understanding composition matters. because the thing is like, there's this sort of like top, what's the word? Like common way of thinking is that sometimes you can do something very naturally or very intuitively. The thing is that it's not always the case. So what is interesting, I think, is to sort of like, once you have a better understanding of a concept, you can sort of use it in different ways. And there's also this sort of line where like learning a new concept to the point that then you don't need to use it like mindfully. But the whole point actually at the first part, I think, of like understanding composition is to be mindful of those concepts that you're using so that you can like actively use them to the point where when you've integrated them enough, you don't need to actually do it like mindfully. So this is like, there's a sort of a retroactive cycle that's this idea of like, there's like three parts in it, and it sort of like helps you feeding one another. So like, for instance, this idea of like analyze your own work in others. So understanding composition, I think, is like one of the best way to analyze more deeply your own work, and also like your like other works. And I'm talking in general, like architecture or visualization, mostly visualization, but it works also on architecture, because once you have a better understanding of how your basically the space that you're designing will be perceived by the people that use it, you will have a better discussion basically with people in order to sort of like better analyze basically and know how it's going to work. More general way, it's like just this idea of creating better work, because the more you're like connected to how the final thing will be experienced, the more you will be able to create better work, better in the sense that it actually achieves the goal that you're after. Because there's the main thing that you don't want to happen basically when you're designing anything is to have like your sort of brief or intent and like, I want to do A, and then the design that I'm doing is actually creating B. So what you want is to have like a proper connection in between. And this, I think, at least in the world of visualization, is something achieved by understanding composition properly. And as I was saying a little bit earlier, is this idea of also being able to communicate better. So in that case, I mean it like communicate better with your client, which is something that is very important actually, because, you know, like this idea of when you're, you have like a good idea, you're trying to express it to your client or like your peers, and they think something else, but you're not in, let's say, knowledgeable enough to explain in a more unbiased way why something does work better. You're just like looking at shapes and like plans and sections, or like this works better, or like looking at images. You know, like the lighting should be like this, or the lighting should be like that, or I don't like this color. And here the idea is that by using composition principles, you can actually, and coming back to this idea of like why, and like asking why, understanding intent, you can actually get a better, like be more direct and like strategic about the sort of issue that you're dealing with the images. Like, is the problem just with the color, or is it like something that can be done in another way? Or is it just like a matter of taste and actually it still achieves the goal that we're after, etc. And one thing that is also interesting to understand is that this cycle is always ongoing, meaning like every time you're going to analyze people, you're going to feed this idea of being able to communicate better. Later, every time you do communicate to a client or to your peers, you're actually strengthening your understanding of composition and those principles. And this idea also, like, there's this like saying that the best way to learn something is to write or to practice, is like really being able to practice those different steps will help you in sort of like keeping the cycle going and learning and strengthening your understanding of the subjects. One thing I want to talk about quickly is this idea of understanding perception, because as I was saying, is like composition is mainly like centered around the idea of like human perception. And even though there are like rules, etc., there's like some concepts about perception that are very strong and sort of like hardwired. This is this idea of like how versus what we perceive. So this is the quote that I mentioned earlier. Our experience of an architectural space is strongly influenced by how we arrive in it. In the case of an architectural space, it is true that, as I was saying, is like the perception that you have of a space is actually completely dependent on how you arrive in it. Meaning, if you enter like a very small space and then the rest of the sequence is a much larger space, the larger space will be defined by the fact that you enter a small space and vice versa. Or if you have like a very dark space, the lighter space will look even lighter because you were in a dark space at first. And the thing is that there's a lot of like perception-based systems and logics that are also present when you do your illustration. And this is why I was like using this quote as like how you arrive in an image. I'll explain to you in a minute that they are like the way your eyes work when you read an image is actually hardwired, in the sense that it doesn't matter your culture, your whatever, is like it's thousands of years of like evolution that makes us look at image the way we look at images. And this is a very important thing to understand, because it means that you can directly have a pretty like good understanding of how people will read the image. And since reading the image is kind of like the first step of understanding something, it means that if you can sort of have a good understanding of how things will be read, then you have a better chance at making your project being understood properly. So yeah, this is what Michael Freeman was saying, that there are principles that exist independently of individual taste. So really this idea that there are like, you can create effects that have like particular or predictable effects. So yeah, as I was saying earlier, it's like having this proper understanding of what are the main principle, the main things that drive your eyes, the main things that drive your sensory systems in general, is like, it will really help you in having a better understanding of how basically the end product that you're creating, which can be an image, can be a building, can actually be like, here I'm like making sort of like parallel with architecture and visualization, but I'm pretty sure you can sort of extend it to quite a bit, because literally everything, like the world we experience and the objects that we use, etc., it's always based on sensory perception and human perception. So there's a case to be made that this whole idea can be sort of like expanded a little. So there's two main ideas that I want to explain. The first one is contrast. Contrast is a very cool concept and very misunderstood, or like, as I was saying, this idea of sometimes we stay a bit too shallow on ideas, and then we think we understood something and we're actually not, we actually miss 90% of the content. And contrast is interesting because I discovered, if I may say, that the whole course of the Bauhaus back in the early 20th century that was designed by Johannes Itten was entirely based on the concept of contrast, meaning like the Bauhaus, they were doing like very diverse, like a very wide range of things, like architecture and objects, painting, etc. But the whole way, like, there were other courses, of course, but like the main course that they were taking in terms of theory and practice at the very beginning was just explained by the idea of contrast. And one of the things you want to notice is that contrast has a ness, meaning there's like many, many types of contrast that you can play with in order to basically build space. And also coming back to this quote that I had at the very beginning, every touch of paint creates a new canvas. So again, like this idea of contrast, where basically in order to understand contrast, you have to have like two things to compare. Like if we look at the definition, I guess everybody kind of knows the concept, like this idea of the state of being strikingly different from something else in juxtaposition or close association. So as you can see, it's like this idea of juxtaposition and close association, meaning you need to have at least two elements to compare. And the idea of the quote is that once you're painting something, like you start from a white canvas, so you already actually have something because there's a contrast between the white canvas and the surrounding that you're in, meaning there's like a whole theory about museology or museography rather, of like what the color of your wall should be based on the color of your painting, because it completely changes the way you perceive the actual colors. And there's like, for instance, I don't know if anybody's like designing museums for their graduation project or whatever, but like there's a whole case around like the fact that like white box museums were mostly designed for contemporary art because it makes like, it emphasizes or like emphasizes the perception of color. Whereas on the other hand, when you're dealing with like more like Baroque and Renaissance and stuff like this, that are more focused on around light, it's actually better to have like colored wall because you perceive the light better. And actually, if you have, I don't know if you've experienced this, but if you have this type of painting on a white wall, everything seems extremely dark. And it sometimes happens in museums, and it's because of the contrast that is created. But back then they were not displayed at all like this. So yeah, this idea of contrast. And yeah, like this is something I think is very important to understand, is like this idea of the contrast logic applies at all scales at all times. So as I was saying, is like you have your canvas or you have your building, and your building is already inserted in a context that is like the urban area, etc. And the contrast or not the contrast that you're creating will already create something in terms of perception. The main idea being when there's contrast, it catches your attention. And so you have the same at like in the architectural space, you will have the same in at all the scale, like with the furniture inside the room, with the room inside the rest of the layout of the building. In an image, you will have the same thing with like what we call local contrast, with like I don't know, like a cutout or like a person and like what the color is on the back of that person, like if it's a wall or like an environment or whatever. And then the overall contrast that you get by looking at the whole picture. And then I was mentioning the sort of contrast of the picture with how it's presented, or even like something you can try to keep in mind is also when you're making like sequences of images, is to look at how the contrast work in between those images. Because if you have like very bright images and suddenly one image that is at night, the bright images will look brighter and the dark images will look darker because of the fact that you're just putting them next to each other. So it sort of like completely changes the perception that you have. Just to mention, like to show this idea of contrast and the fact that it like really translates in many areas. Here's just like definitely not an extensive list, but this idea of like yeah, basic one, like where is my, no, not this. The like large small is like the basic one that we usually understand. Long short or broad narrow, like light dark is like basically it's usually the one we understand the most, because when we look at contrast or think of contrast, we think of like the Photoshop adjustment and we just have like different types of values. But you can have like many different ones that are quite interesting. You can also have like in terms of materiality, the idea of hard and soft, or like reflective and non-reflective, etc. So all this thing is interesting because the idea is that contrast is what leads your eye through the canvas, or in a building, contrast is what lead your eyes around the building, basically. If you have a room that has the entire same material, same type of geometry, same type of everything, then your eye will tend to sort of like wander around because there's no anchor anywhere that will sort of catch your eye. This is coming back to this idea of the museum, for instance. The white box are like designed that way and like very usually quite geometrical or like orthogonal, so that the point of interest becomes the painting. The thing is, as I was saying, it sort of like fucks up the perception because of the contrast. But the contrast in terms of geometry, if I may say, or space, is this idea that everything is like very simple, and then suddenly you have like an artwork. In terms of image, we'll see just in a second the concept of a greatest area of contrast, but like this idea of the contrast within an image is what will lead your eye, meaning you sort of like experience the line where the contrast is happening, which is something that is very fun to do when you sort of like try to be mindful, or how's it called, like I don't have the word anymore, but like of being conscious of the fact that you're conscious of something. One thing that you can, I think that is important to understand and remember in terms of concept is this idea of greatest area of contrast. Greatest area of contrast is like the area in an image that has the strongest contrast, as its name entails, whether light on dark or dark on light. And it's something though that you don't want to mistake, even though sometimes it's the same, but it's not necessarily the brightest area or like the largest, brightest area in an image. It's just, it can be actually very local if the contrast is higher. So one simple example that I can often show, just to change this, is so here's like a portrait by Steve McCurry, and there's a couple of things that is interesting when it comes to portrait, is that we are as human very let's say like naturally attracted to eyes. But the thing is that in a portrait, even though there's already this aspect of like human looking at human, the eyes are actually the greatest area of contrast of usually any portrait. And what is fun is that actually, if you had like a painting or a portrait or whatever, that where the greatest area of contrast was not the eyes, you would like your eyes would wander around to that other specific area that you created, which again, one thing that is important with composition is this idea that there's not bad or good. It's not necessarily bad or good that you don't look at the eye at the first glance in the image. It just means that you have to be aware that this is what's going to happen. And then you have to assess if this is what you want your viewer to be experiencing when they're looking at the image. Another example, sorry, by Rembrandt. This one, so Rembrandt is especially interesting, just something I want to mention for like renderings rather than architecture. But he was like one of the first to use like this called fake lights, in the sense that he's very deliberate in how the light is working in his images. What I mean by this is that maybe it's not the best example, but I want to mention it, is like this idea that even if you had like a ray of light coming one way and that should sort of light a certain way, he will, if there's one person that he doesn't want to emphasize, he will just say, well, I'm not going to put any light on that guy, even though physically speaking, he should be in the light as well. And so there's this whole idea of being, and this sort of comes from the idea that the greatest area of contrast is the area where your eyes are going to be drawn to at first. And if you sort of extend this area, it sort of loses its power. There's the like a couple of things, maybe I'm mentioning it later. Basically, if your greatest area of contrast is very compact, it means that your eyes are going to be very quickly drawn to a very specific point in your image. So if you look at any image, not any, but like a very good chunk of images done by Rembrandt, he has like this idea of having very dark elements and just a single element very highly highlighted, so that your eyes are usually drawn to it. There's a whole work on colors as well, but the work in values is already very important in how you read the image. Another image or photograph by, well, it's not Rembrandt, it's Ansel Adams. I forgot to change it. And the idea here is that I was saying, when you have like a very specific point, your eyes will be drawn to it. But when your greatest area of contrast is geometric, not element, but like a segment or a line or a curve, etc., instead of being focused on it, you will sort of like follow it, which is also something very interesting if you want to sort of have your subject here and lead your eyes to a specific element. And here we're talking about an image, but you can have exactly the same in a building, where depending on how you open your windows and have like your openings in the building and have like a certain type of light, you'll end up with certain shapes that will sort of make you understand more or less how to experience the space, if you're supposed to go one way or another, etc. And also we'll sort of divide the space between like basically dark and light, and have like, how can I say this? This sort of like more dynamic perception of the space, if I may say. On the other hand, the idea of low contrast is like kind of the opposite, where basically by having very low contrast, the eyes, instead of like focusing on a single element, even though these are maybe sticking out slightly, but the idea is that the lower the contrast you have, the more your eyes will just wander around the image. So in terms of like, this is basically the idea is that high contrast create like dynamic reading, and low contrast will create calmer reading. So depending on what you're trying to achieve in your image, or what you're trying to achieve in your architecture as well, and like your space, the light that you're going to have is going to have a different impact on the way you experience the space. This is why, for instance, in office space, you tend to have like very soft light, because you want something very homogeneous that doesn't disturb you. If you had like a very strong contrast between like light and dark, it will sort of catch your eye, if I may say. And in an image, if you have like very high contrast, then as I was saying, you're going to like very quickly go to a specific point inside the image rather than look at the rest. And in terms of, you will look at the rest, but it's just this question of timing. And you have like this concept of first reading and second reading. And the first reading is like this sort of hardwired one, where you look at what you're supposed to look at because of like the evolution of our brain over time, basically. Just to like, I picked one image just to explain more in terms of very quickly other types of contrast. basically you can have like shapes or line contrast where you have like very straight lines against like more what's the word, like curved ones. You can have like very rough material against like more reflective and soft material, or even like stone here. You can have like very, whoops, completely drunk, like verticals that are like against this sort of like more organic shapes, etc. You can have also in terms of light. Here you can see, for instance, the light contrast is very low. You can still read the light entering, but at the same time, everything is very like bathed in light. So you don't have like, it's more the structure of the image itself that leads you right to the center, because it's like a very geometrical and symmetrical composition. But if I had like a completely different light, I could actually have like maybe emphasize only this aspect or like close this one, etc. So there's a lot of stuff that happen, and you sort of like have to get a sense of the hierarchy of how you're reading the space. Here it's just the same concept. And the second concept that I want to explain quickly is this idea of balance, or balances actually. So balance is like the way contrast and tension neutralize each other within the frame. So this idea of like, as I was saying, is like you have contrast, you have tension, and you can resolve them in different ways. And depending on how you resolve them, it will end up being one type of balance, because we like to say there's this sort of like idea that I personally don't really like, that an image always has to be balanced. But this thing is that it's not necessarily true, because it actually depends on what you're trying to do. So your image doesn't necessarily need to be balanced. And as we'll see, there are like 4 types of balance that you can work with, and that create different types of reading in your image. And what is interesting is to sort of like have those in mind, so that when you're composing your image, or when you're coming back to the sort of like architectural spaces, like how you're making the actual spaces be like relate to each other, if they're like very similar or they're very different, if there's like one that is very big and one is very small, or like they're all like very similar, it will completely change the type of balance and the way you experience things. Those type of balance, though, like the 4-1 here, I'll explain them more in terms of visualization rather than architecture, to be honest. The first one is called formal balance. So formal balance is basically this, everything is sort of like centered. Usually you have like a frontal view, and everything is centered on like the vanishing point of your image. And you have like generally a very, how do you say, like everything is sort of like balanced, basically. So there's no, everything is sort of like concurring to making you not look outside of the frame or on the sides, but more on the very center of the image. And this has like the effect of having like something that looks generally quite calm, quite imposing, etc. This is like a Grand Budapest Hotel from Wes Anderson. He's like pretty famous for doing like this type of frontal shots that are like very like organized and composed. On another hand, like if you want a slightly different type of formal balance that is still formal balance, this is like Parasite by Bong Joon-ho. And here you have like this sort of symmetry, like axial symmetry, where you have like different dynamics that are going in different direction. But the thing is like the overall perception of the space is very balanced. There's no like, all the white spots are sort of compensated. So in the end, you're sort of like looking in slightly different direction, experiencing the space in a sort of like quite calm way. There's no like super sharp light entering the space. There's no like color that is catching your eye. There's like the subjects are almost at the same, not the same scale, but like here, this guy is closer, but is actually half cut, and this girl is like in the back is further, so it's smaller, etc. So there's like this idea of how you can balance different objects in something a bit more dynamic and still keep the idea of something being formally balanced. Here's another photograph by Laurent Cronenthal, who's like a French photographer. And here again, like this idea of frontal image, sorry, and very symmetrical. Usually there's like, when you have a symmetrical image or symmetrical project, formal balance, will work very well, because it really emphasizes the symmetry of the building, or the sort of like the way it stands in the context. So it's something that is quite important to understand and to see. Basically, the idea would be like understanding what is your project, understanding how you want to depict it, and understand if maybe this type of balance and composition would actually benefit the way you want your project to be perceived. So yeah, formal balance is the main ideas, I guess, is like this idea of axial symmetry, calm feeling because stuff are like sort of in place and not moving, and generally one point perspective image. Informal balance is like kind of well, definitely not the same, but it's like sort of spin on it, where the idea is that you have two subjects that you are dealing with, and they sort of create a dialogue, and the dialogue is like sort of creating like leading your eye to sort of go in between the two subjects. So instead of being centered perfectly on the middle, you're actually going to be like ping-ponging, or whatever that's called in English, in between several subjects in the frame. Because here, for instance, if we imagine that this guy is not here, you will actually have a perfectly formal balance where all your attention is completely focused on this very subject. Whereas here, you have like, there's a lot happening. I mean, I could literally do like a 30-minute explanation of what is happening in your brain and how it works and why it works the way it works. But like the fact that you have the guy looking that way, that you have what we call like aspective view. So it's like the silhouette of someone that sort of catches your eye. So there's a lot of things happening for such a simple composition that make it work. You can also notice in terms of contrast that we have like the light is very soft. So everything is like, you have a bit of contrast with the building against the sky, but the sky is very like simple and light. So there's like most of what's happening is in the lower part. And actually this is in terms of balance. Again, you have like this idea of having like what we call negative space in the top and something a bit more dense in terms of information in the lower part. Here's it's a shot from The Fountain by Darren Aronofsky, and here you have like, before the elements I was showing are like kind of similar size. Here is like you have like a much bigger tree and like the main character of the movie, and like shapes also that sort of helps. But here you have like this idea of informal balance where you have this dialogue that's created in between the two subjects, and you're trying to sort of pick the relationship that you want to create, because you could like, there are many ways you can frame a shot. But here, for instance, Darren Aronofsky chose to have like the tree being much bigger than the guy, but you could have like the guy in the very foreground and be like much important in terms of narrative than the tree, etc., or like have them in the same plane. So all these decisions have like a very important consequence on how you read the image, and like in terms of narrative as well. Here's the same with like a painting by John Constable, where you have like one of your subject and like sort of sub-subjects that you're sort of basically balancing the main subject, which is this church here, cathedral, with like tree elements and people. And what is fun to know, let's say, is that people in general have a very heavy weight in composition, more than necessarily. You can have like a big tree here that will have less weight than those two people here, because of the fact that we as human are more interested in people generally than by trees. So there's something to understand that like regarding informal balance is that you can create unbalance by even adding like a very simple element, but that in terms of hierarchy in our brain actually has like a lot of weight. So to sort of like tie it back also to the what John Ruskin was saying is like, as soon as you add an element in an image, it completely shifts the way you understand the image itself. So informal balance, generally two subjects. You can have a bit more if you want, and there's also like the idea of how you group them that sort of change the perception. Dialogue between subjects. So yeah, this idea of like how you create relationship with something. So for instance, as soon as you're like, if we take like an imaginary case where you're like dealing with a building and you want to create a relationship with something, you usually will rely on like this idea of informal balance, and depending on the scale and the weight they have in the composition, you will create a different perception of the relationship that you're creating between the building or the space and the people or whatever. And generally also more dynamic because, well, as I said, instead of having a single point that you're focusing on, your eyes will tend to wander or like go in between the two subjects of your image. Another thing that is quite interesting in terms of composition and balance is this idea of the reveal. This is basically the idea of like a time-based understanding of the image. As I was saying earlier, there's like an idea of how's it called? First reading and second reading. And basically the idea of the reveal is that you use a certain type of element that will catch your eye very quickly in the image. And then only you will start reading the rest of the image as a second reading. So for instance, normally you have like a sort of a first reading by like looking at all those little lights. And then after you sort of see in the fog, because of the very low contrast, the shape of the people, even though here they're centered. So it's like kind of a, maybe not the best example, but if I look at this one, for instance, which is a photograph by Gregory Crutzen, if you don't know this photographer, he's like, what is interesting about his work is that all his photographs are like entirely composed, and most of them are like stage set. So sometimes they even build like houses and stuff just to get stuff done, which is quite nice. So it means that basically everything that is in the frame, just like in the rendering that is like digital, is actually here for a reason. And here you have like this this idea of like, generally you have like for instance the line and something very like frontal that sort of leads you to look at those people, and then looking at this person you actually see that they're looking at something that is on fire here. It's very rare that people notice this first, because the image is more composed on like making you focus on the center first, and then creating this relationship between the right side and the left side. And also one thing that is very smart, let's say, is that the fact that it's very far on the edge means it catches slightly less attention because of the strong composition in the middle at first, or the center. And I'll finish with this one that I quite like. It's a painting by Caspar David Friedrich. And this one is quite interesting because just you have like a first reading, let's say, of this like ruins. And then by looking a little bit better, you have like this sort of little houses. And the way that it's sort of hidden is done by the almost absence of contrast that you have between the colors here. You have only those little elements that sort of catch your eye, and the little people here. So you have like a sense of scale, but basically this sort of like reading that you have is more a bit like up to down rather than going straight to that element, even though it's like kind of arguable maybe. But the idea is like how by having low contrast, you sort of like, it takes you like an extra second to understand what you're looking at basically. So yeah, the reveal, you can usually do it by like spatial organizations, as I was saying with the Gregory Crutzen, like having something on the far side. The idea of frame within the frame as well is like when you have like literally like you're looking through a window or whatever, you'll first look at the window, then inside the window, and sort of creates a little time aspect that is quite interesting. Tonal range and imbalance is basically this idea of like how you, by lowering contrast or like managing like differently the balance that you have, you can actually make people or make the viewer look at something first that is not exactly the main subject. And the last one, talking about this idea of balance or imbalance, or the fact that something always needs to be balanced, is that this idea of balance is very subjective. And sometimes what you want is to actually, when you want to emphasize like something generally regarding scale, is this idea of how you can sort of put like most of your canvas, or most of your canvas, or like real estate or whatever, on something that is I won't say like not important, but like kind of secondary, so that then the scale of the rest is extremely small, because we want to emphasize like this is more like in the like landscape artist and all their sort of romanticism, etc. So there's like a lot of idea of how you want to romanticize the like nature. And in order to sort of have this sort of sense of awe, etc., you sort of like really emphasize one aspect that sort of like dwarfs the rest of the image. So this is something that you can definitely do on your images as well, as like when you want to like minimize the impact of a building or whatever, and you just emphasize the rest of the image. And imbalance. So yeah, like subjects particularly small, or one object or area is overly emphasized. Contrast between subjects, scale is heightened. So yeah, really this idea of like, when you want to really emphasize a scale difference, you just go all the way by having something very tiny and the rest extremely big, and generally particularly dynamic and inspiring. So yeah, it's like this idea of how you can like really emphasize the contrast and go like sort of like one step above what you would usually get in terms of a perception. I think I have this one that is very short, and then we can move on to the workshop. But just to clarify this notion of intent. So perception is very important in order to sort of understand what you're doing with your image. But then intent is like basically understanding what it is you're trying to do. So like as I was saying, you can't separate form from substance. And intent is like this idea of clearly formulated or planned intention. So basically what you're trying to achieve with your projects. And what is interesting is that it can seem very like obvious or secondary, not secondary, but like trivial. But the thing is that if you start losing the focus on this aspect and understanding that this can actually needs to lead like sort of like inform all the general decisions that you're making, whether in the architectural part or in the design part or the visualization part, then you start being a bit more random in the way you take decisions. So understanding intent and sort of like clarifying it is a very important thing to understand, I'd say. One thing that is important, not important, but like worth mentioning, let's say, is that generally we say an image should have like one main subject, which is true, but it can have several intents because there's different typologies of intents and different ways of showing something. So I won't go in depth on the concept, but basically when I'm teaching about it, I explain that there's like generally 4 ways of showing something. So you have like this idea of perception is like what we perceive. So it's like more related to shapes rather than actual objects. So the way you will read the image is by like actually using lines and being able to like create shapes that are like read by our mind, but they are not actually there. It's just the way we perceive the canvas, if I may say. You have then the images and like what is there. So the objects that you're showing that can then help you like convey information, etc. Then you have inference. This I think is mostly related to like program, where you basically put elements in the project that sort of like make you understand what is the program about. Like, is it a school? Is it like a museum? Is it an opera or whatever? And final one is the emotion, like what we feel. This is generally more related to lighting and color, meaning it doesn't even, it's like something on top of the image is like depending on how you use the color, depending on how you use the light, it will completely shift the way you understand the image. And you can have like, it's very fun to see sometimes you have like very well like framed image, but by having a completely let's call it wrong, but it's not the word I want, but like wrong lighting, it emphasizes something completely different in the scene, and then you don't understand exactly what they were trying to do. Whereas if you have like a proper intent that is clear in your mind, then you will be able to use it to sort of direct the light and the color in your image and sort of then create the feeling you want in the eye of the viewer. So basically how to use intent in your project is basically by asking many questions about like, how do I want my viewer to read the image? What type of elements do I need there in order for people to understand what's going on and what they should understand? What elements do I want my viewer to understand on top of what is there? So it's like, what are the stuff I can suggest by using light, color, or like motions or things like this? And then it's just a matter of like, let's call it creativity, is like how to come up with solutions that are subtle enough that they don't completely change or shift the balance of your image, but that still sort of create the effect that you want. And one thing that we'll do in the workshop very quickly is this idea of like questioning the brief. Is like sometimes it's very fun to see when you have like clients that tell you we just need a shot of like this facade and they just stop the thing here, and you're like, yeah, but what do you want to actually show about this facade? Because if you only have like this type of information, you can do like literally millions of options that will show this facade. It's just that you have to ask more questions about your own project and know like what's the type of materiality that I have, what's the type of lighting that will emphasize this type of materiality, what's the type of like, where's the entrance? Is it important? Do I want to emphasize it or do I want to not emphasize it? Meaning this can lead you to how you frame your subject or how you light your subject. If you put like direct light mainly on your entrance, then this will become like, as we were talking about, the greatest area of contrast. So then it means this is the area you're going to like most focus on your image. But if it's secondary, then you can like rebalance it by doing something different, by having like more light or more like eye-catching colors in a different area, etc. So depending on this, you need like a way more extensive list of the things and the effect that you're trying to create, or at least to double check that the final effect that you're creating is not like contrary or opposite to what you're actually hoping to create in terms of perception for your project. And this, of course, is this is the part where it's kind of subjective, in the sense that it's up to you to know how you want your project to be perceived. But then the translation of those concepts and what you want to do into imagery here is like a little bit less subjective, because there are things that work and things that don't work, basically. So the idea is to sort of like generate ideas about your project, like what are all the stuff I could potentially do, and then sort of like sort them and call them in order to keep what is doable. And so yeah, really this idea, as I was saying, and I'll use that as a quick conclusion, is this idea you can't compose without intent. So really try to clarify as much as possible what you're trying to do. I had like this very like small example that I like to tell, where so I'll do like the visualization aspect and sort of expand it to the architectural aspect, just so that you can maybe have this one last example in mind. I was working on the visuals for like the Opéra Bastille. They were like redoing the lobby, basically. And if I had my client telling me we're redoing like the facade, etc., of this building, and we need a photo of the facade, photo rendering of the facade and a rendering of the lobby, if heard like this, what would at least most archivist people go to in terms of images would be something like just before, or like the show starts, etc., and you have like something very like lively and with like people dressed well, etc., entering the space, etc. Like a very, I want to call it like basic idea of what an image could look like for an opera. The thing is, the actual brief was about the idea of reorganizing the lobby so that it becomes a space you can use throughout the whole day, and not simply something that is used at night for a presentation. So actually all the renderings were more done around the idea of how can you use the space during daytime, and how you can sort of have like different uses that are not directly related to the opera. And in terms of project as well, when you read the brief, it's like it's a completely different thing to think about when you're trying to design just a space in which people will wait 5 minutes and then go to a concert, than to design a space where people would actually actively, purposefully come to that space, not even to go to the opera, but to actually just like enjoy the space and like have a coffee, or like use it as a co-working space or whatever. So it's a completely different way of dealing with things. And this is entirely tied back to the idea of intent and how you clarify this intent. It's already 1 hour, 10 minutes in. So I don't know, I had like small other slides regarding other topics, but I don't know if you want me to stop here, Justin.
I'm happy for you to keep going. It's up to you how you use the rest of the time.
Okay.
Are they important to the workshop?
They're pretty, yeah, they could be useful, and it's like just a quick recap. So maybe that should help.
Maybe just go through them and call out the key things that are going to be relevant for the workshop.
Okay, so I'll just do that quickly. So as I was explaining in this sort of diagram at the very beginning, the idea of how composition, like a mix of terrible diagram, but like framing, intent, frame, light, and colors. So what I want to do is just to explain to you very quickly the three others, just so that you have a rough idea of how deep you can sort of question those topics on any for your own visuals after. So the key concepts, for instance, is like when it comes to framing, I'll just spend literally 2 minutes on this. One thing that is interesting, for instance, I want to mention, the idea of aspect ratio. There's here you have like, you're lucky because you'll do like your panel and you will be able to decide like what's the layout. But actually what is important to understand is that the aspect ratio of your frame actually completely defines how you experience and understand the building that you're inscribing it in. If, for instance, the building is very vertical and you're framing it in a very horizontal aspect ratio, you're creating like tensions or like releasing tensions. And this sort of like creates a completely different way of perceiving, if I may say, the building. So generally what we do is to have like an aspect ratio that sort of fits the size or like the overall aspect ratio or shape of the building. One thing also that is interesting is that even without even putting anything in the canvas, you already have tensions happening in your frame, because we have a way of experiencing the world. As I was saying, there's like a lot of like hardwired stuff in our brain. And one thing, for instance, is that we know that square aspect ratio tend to be very like calm and like very, because there's no tension. Everything is like sort of equidistant. Well, if it was equidistant, it would be a circle, but like this idea of like all the tension are sort of like neutralized, meaning any object you will put in there will look a bit like more in place than if you're like having it a bit more like wide or whatever. So it's something to, I think is quite interesting to have in mind. And which one could I choose in there? Well, negative space is a very basic one, but it's something that I think some people tend to forget, is like how much negative space is really, that's what we were talking about earlier. When you have like your building, and depending on if you crop here or here, you have like a completely different perception, because of like what we were saying about this sort of like unbalanced image, where you put like a lot of emphasis on like the context or whatever, if it's an indoor image. But like negative space is like basically the space where your eyes will rest. So if you feel like you're having an image that has like a lot of stuff going on, but you don't want the image to feel like it's crammed with information, then the usual way of going is to have like more negative space. Negative space is not necessarily sky. It can be like, if you have a white wall, it can be considered as negative space as well. It's just area in your image that has very low information density. And I'll stop that for the frame thing. I think it's the two main ones that are quite, I don't know, there's one last one regarding the typologies of framing. Typologies of framing is just like basically the distance you have between you and your subject. And depending on how close you are from a subject, you have to sort of internally understand that you will be able to show different types of information. So basically the base is like, if you have like what we call like a contextual shot or whatever, is that if you're very far, you're going to have like a good understanding of all the context around your project. So if you're looking for conveying information about the context, it means that you should very quickly try to like zoom out and have like a better perception of the context and inscribe your project in it. If on the other hand, you're dealing more with like materials and like details and like the way people use the space, you're gonna want to be a bit closer, etc. It's kind of logical, but sometimes when people tell me like, I'm trying to convey this type of information, I'm like, yeah, but you're way too close to show this type of thing, or you're way too far to convey this type of information. The typical one being, I want to convey like subtleties of material, but you're so far that actually you can't read the materials. So this is something to, I think, keep in mind as well. And this, I've put it 3 times, and the other thing anyway, this idea of you can always compensate components. So again, one thing that is nice is that the fact that all these are like interlinked, it means that anywhere you're pushing one direction here, you can still push back here. So meaning if you have a framing that sort of focus on a specific formal balance, and you have something very like, let's say calm, etc., but actually you want it to be more dynamic, you can use like a more dynamic light to have like only an area of that subject that is very bright and that sort of catches your eye, and the rest is a bit like subdued, etc. Or on the other hand, if you have like a lighting system that makes it that you don't want it to be, that it doesn't look the way you want, you can sort of frame it differently by maybe cropping the area that you don't want, etc. So it's very this idea of like, every decision you take is like important, but at the same time, you can always fall back on other topics or other components to sort of compensate stuff that are happening that you don't want to happen. Generally, it will happen because of constraints, like the site looks a certain way and I can't do it the other way, or like I'm dealing with well, in your case, it's a south facade, so I don't have sun. So, but I want to have something light. So basically, it's like maybe you're going to rely on like artificial lighting or soft light, etc. So there's a lot of stuff you can sort of compensate. It's quite important, I think. Key concepts regarding light. The weight of light, so coming back to this idea of greatest area of contrast and the fact that light basically relate to value. If you check your image in black and white and sort of like blur it, it will give you like the sort of greatest area of contrast very quickly, and you'll sort of see where you should be looking at very quickly in your image. And what you want to double check is the thing I'm looking at first in my image, is the thing I want my viewer to look at first or not? And also light typologies, and I'll finish on this. Light typologies is like, depending on basically the weather you have. So it's good to have like a sort of understanding of how light behaves during the day, and not go like, I think there's like two extremes that are fun. You can either go all the way to like standardize and be like, I have like blue skies all the time, or you have like the other way where everything is dramatic. Sorry, everything is dramatic all the time. This is sometimes what students do, at least in France, where they have like very heavy skies, etc. But it actually doesn't serve their intent, in the sense that they just want the image to look cool, but it doesn't even like convey the information that they want, because in the end they have this very heavy sky, like a storm or whatever, that sort of is so overwhelming in terms of composition that the building becomes completely secondary, but not in a good way. You can have like a building becoming secondary because you read it in a second reading and sort of experience it, but you can also have it becoming so secondary that you don't even pay attention to the subject anymore. So yeah, and color. One thing that is important in color is like basically the idea of color weights, I'd say, and like color contrasts. There's like, I think it's, I forgot his name, honestly, and it's not Johannes Seaton, it's whatever. Like there's 7 types of contrast in terms of color that are important to understand. There's like hue, saturation, etc. And all those are interesting to understand, because it means that when you have colors that are happening, you can play a lot with them in order to make them look like you want. And also you have to sort of adjust the colors in your image, because sometimes you have like the typical thing I see sometimes, that you have like a nice building or a nice frame or whatever, and they put a red car just driving by, and they're thinking it's just a car, it's fine. But the fact that it's red is actually catching so much attention that it detracts from the whole, like it completely shifts the balance of your image. And it's something like sometimes small details like this that colors are very important at, and you can like use it the other way around, of course, is like by having like saturated or bright colors in areas that you want people to look at. This is like, if you look at the work of like Dominique Coulon, which is like one of my clients actually, where he works a lot with colors in terms of architecture this time. And the contrast of like very white space and then having like very bright colors or saturated colors completely changes the way you experience the space, and it sort of like catches your attention very quickly. So it's the same in an image, depending on the colors you're dealing with. And yeah, that's it for the quick talk.
Thanks, Simon. A lot of information to take on board, but I think it's you know, if there's one lesson from the talk, is that actually like composition, image production and architecture is actually a real like topic in itself, and something that's really valuable to kind of delve into, not just, you know, for the production of nice images, but to convey meaning. So I took away a lot from what you're talking about. I particularly loved your idea of like expanding the notion of contrast from just, you know, values in Photoshop to something that sort of, it could be geometric, it could be material, it could be lighting, exactly. Like that actually all those elements play a role in how a space might be read in an image, or even experienced in reality. You know, whether you use light timber or dark timber, you know, black fittings, light fittings, whatever, the sum total of all that really inflects how you comprehend the spaces that we encounter. So that was really fascinating. One thing I kind of want to just quickly touch on before we get into the workshop is actually a question about like process. As someone who produces hundreds of images, what and with this kind of vast body of knowledge that you have around lighting, color, subject, composition, proportion, those kinds of things, where do you start to compose an image? Do you start by kind of focusing on the meaning of the image, or do you start by through an iterative process of kind of trying to position a camera in digital space? What's like the first step that you take?
The first thing, at least with client, but that I would do as well with my own images, really, as you said, is like try to understand what you're trying to convey, because this is what drives all the decision-making process after. So it can sort of evolve a little as you're like working on the image and be like, actually, I could show this or whatever. But generally, it's good to have like a quick, or even like not extensive necessarily, but like the idea of what the client was working towards. So what I usually ask for is like sketches of design that they had, of like design intentions and things like this, because they're usually quite important to get the original idea. A problem you might have sometimes though is that maybe the architectural design, the final design, is actually not really a good translation of the sketches that they have initially. That's something I mentioned like last time we talked, is like this idea of sometimes you have like people talking a lot about transparency, and when you look at their plans, there's no transparency at all. But if you look at their sketches, there was like all these little diagrams with like arrows going through windows, and like, yeah, we're going to see through this and through that. And then when you look at the actual final design, when they reorganized the stuff, they sort of lost the strength of the sketch. And what is interesting is that sometimes, but not only to a certain extent, you can sort of compensate this loss in the visuals by sort of like really focusing on that aspect and making it like even more visible. So if it's like talking about transparency, then you'll have like an image that is really focused so much around that subject that it will really make the building understandable around that lens, even though actually when you look at the plan, maybe it's not that obvious. So it's something also that is interesting, I think, is to always have this idea of complementary documents. You don't want to show the exact same thing with all the documents you're doing, because you only have like that much space and that much time to explain. So it's good to have like stuff that show different things and that sort of like complement each other. And then from there on, it's like, as you said, very iterative thing. It's definitely not a step-by-step process. The first step will always be understanding intent, but then from there on, it's like more an idea of experience, because then you start having like rules of thumb of like, if he wants to show this, I need this type of framing and this type of lighting, and then you start experiencing and experimenting, this type of frame. You place cameras, you try lights, you check like the context. There's a lot of stuff regarding like how, well, depending on the intent, but usually I like to just have a proper look at the context of the building if it's for exterior shots, just to see if there are like interesting stuff happening around.
That's really interesting as well, because like they're just thinking about your process and kind of iterative process, but also the way you describe things here was using a lot of precedents that are both contemporary and historical. I know when I'm designing a project, I'll often have several books on my table looking through for organizational ideas, not just like images to copy, but lessons. Sure. And so do you work with images in front of you that you're referencing as well, just to try and understand how to go about
this is something I didn't mention because the talk was already too long, but there's one thing that I mentioned in the composition, like why it matters, is this idea of being able to analyze deeper an image. And of course, it's very important to work with references, but as you said, like there's a difference between having a reference and copying it, and having a reference and being able to understand exactly how the composition is working, so that you can extract very specific aspect of it and insert them in your own projects by actually creating your own thing, your own spin on it. And it's only, I think, that's why I think I have like not issues, but like students are usually reluctant to use references for that aspect because they just straightforwardly copy things and just like do a patchwork. But the thing is to have like a deep, like more like broader understanding of like looking, as you were mentioning, like the study of like contrast and how maybe different shapes work together, and just understanding the mere logic of it. And then you can apply it without just necessarily copying the space itself, but just copying the logic of it in your own building, just to experience it the same way, etc. And it's the same with images. So yeah, no, definitely I'll have like many references when I'm working. And it's one thing that I do in the workshop that I do is that I'll show, like, for instance, on one project, all the references I'm using, but I'm explaining how I'm using them, so that they can see that sometimes it's just about color palettes. Sometimes and it can be like, I mean, literally, I use a lot of photos of like fashion and stuff. So it's like sneakers and things, but I use them for color palettes. And people are like, why do you have like photos of sneakers? Like, yeah, but just because usually the lighting in studio lighting is very interesting. So when you do indoor images, it actually is very helpful to have more advanced stuff, because the problem with, I almost like on purpose try to have very few actual visualization or architectural image as references, because they're very constraining very quickly. It's harder to sort of like abstract from them and see them differently, but I still use them like some of the time. But it's good to use different stuff.
That's really interesting. Eamon's got his hand up. Eamon, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Hey, Simon. Thank you for your informative talk. I was just really curious about your workflow. Like, what are the softwares you use and whatnot? What render engine do you use?
So a quick thing I'll mention before that, even though the question is interesting, to answer quickly, I use well, my clients send me stuff on SketchUp usually, but I'll just import everything in 3ds Max and then use V-Ray. So it's a very straightforward workflow, and it depends. I could maybe show you later, but I have like, I used to do a lot of post-production before, so a lot of Photoshop, because I was basically bad at 3ds Max. And the more like after 5 or 6 years, you start to be able to do decent project and the 3D starts to look better. So like, let's say when I started, I was like maybe 30% 3D and 70% post-production. Nowadays, it's more like the opposite. It kind of depends on the project. Sometimes like if you have aerial views, it's better to have like a photo in which you insert the thing, and then it's like very easy to just insert and have like 90% done in Photoshop, etc. One thing though is, and this is why I think composition was an important topic, is that it's completely how you say, like render agnostic. So it's like, it doesn't matter what software you're using, the principles always apply. You could even say like, because I work with like Belgian practices, and they're a lot into like collage and things like this, but the principles are exactly the same in how you're going to read a collage, or how you're going to read like if you look at the work of Eva Leroy, who's doing like line work, incredible line work by hand, and it's still the same principle of like contrast, but like taken to even higher level because it's just black and white. But yes, and this is something I actually had in mind, is like this idea of how you can have something that works whatever the software you're using.
Something that's really, that's just to follow on from Eamon's question about software. I guess once you start working in the 3D Max environment and whatnot, technical understanding of things like photography really start to make a difference to how you set up your images as well. Like thinking about focal length and ISO and all that kind of stuff. Like how might someone kind of think about some of this image composition in terms of, say, photography, if that's what they're already kind of used to messing around with?
That's a funny. What is interesting is that even though like 3ds Max and V-Ray especially is like sort of designed to work as a camera, the thing is that you have all the good part of a camera and none of the bad parts, meaning usually there's like stuff like you don't want to raise your ISO too much because otherwise you're going to have like very noisy images, etc. But this doesn't happen in the 3D, and you can raise your ISO to like 6 million if you want. It doesn't change anything regarding this. So there's still like some sort of the logic that applies, like your focal length, not the focal length. The aperture is going to set up how much depth of field you have, etc. So it's good to have this type of knowledge because just to know the logic of how it works behind. The thing is, like, I mean, I had this knowledge, so it was easier to understand. But to a certain extent, I think there's like much simpler software. Like if you look at SketchUp or like, how's it called, like Twinmotion and things like this, maybe they probably use still like camera settings, but it's just a matter of like sliding, like moving a slider. And even if you don't understand what it really means, you can see in the image directly what's happening, and you're like, oh, okay, it changes this. So this is actually one of the things that is sort of motivating in a way, is that the more the technical aspect becomes completely secondary, the more we can start focusing more on the fundamentals, because it's, well, I don't want to go like exaggerate, but it's getting easier and easier to make realistic images, because it's just, yeah, you have like material libraries for free. You have like a lot of tutorials on like the technical aspect that are very easy to find, and just the software themselves are super easy to use, like really just out of the box. I'm using V-Ray, which is like literally, I think if I started using V-Ray 10 years ago, I would have, not 10 years, 15 years ago, I would have quit it, because there was so much technical aspect to it where you had to change all the settings all the time to just get something, and then it took like 10 minutes to render a preview. Whereas nowadays, literally 99% of the time you use the default settings and it looks fine. And it's just, actually, it sort of makes people understand that it's more about the composition, because you have like technically accurate images, but they're still very underwhelming. So it's more about like how you actually compose your image that makes them interesting, even though there's still like also the discrepancy between like very high-end, highly realistic image and like more like standard. But
one last question before we go to the workshop, because I know we've actually kind of run a fair bit over, but it's an interesting discussion. We see a lot, like go through a lot of like architects' websites, Arc Daily, all these kind of like publications, and you just get saturated with images. For a presentation, you know, a studio presentation, better to focus on a couple of images, or better to go with more, or is there no like hard and fast rule on quantity of images?
I don't think I've ever talked my client into making less images, but
that's because you get paid by the image, Simon.
Yeah, but it's definitely an interesting question. I think, like, coming back to this idea of intent, there's this idea also you need to have an intent on the sequence or the overall presentation that you have. Like, for instance, when I was doing my graduation project, I had like many images. I literally did like a comic book, because the whole idea was to tell a story. So I needed like very simple images, but many of them to sort of have a narrative going. But on the other side, if your project has like a very straightforward and like strong approach, you might be able to get away with like a single image. On average, when I do competitions, we have like 2 or 3 images maximum. So it's you don't need I mean, it's good if you want to convey more, but it's just like you have to always be also just like aware of what you're showing, and also like the sort of consistency of your narrative or like your explanation throughout the images. You don't want to have like images that sort of contradict each other because you didn't spend enough time on the one you're adding at the end, and then you're like, oh, but this space actually doesn't look at all like how we would feel it looked from the rest of your images. So there's no like rules for sure, but usually I would say less is better than more, because at least you spend more time focusing on what really matters. And also on the image itself, I think it's better to focus on like composition and having something that looks right, even if like in terms of the overall quality, or like maybe not finishing everything and the materials are not exactly right, etc. I think it's better to have something that manages to convey information properly, rather than have something that just looks good but in the end doesn't tell anything about the subject. So it's like a fine line to walk. Intent
is the key thing. Simon, thank you so much for a really thought-provoking and very dense talk. I'd like to give you a couple of minutes just to kind of catch your breath and have a glass of water if you need to. But maybe we should just transition into the workshop. So students, if you could turn your cameras on if you're going to participate in the workshop so that we can get a bit of kind of visual feedback from you, that would be great. And yeah, Simon, happy for you just to kick it off whenever you're ready. You take a break if you need to.
No, it's okay. I'll take a break when they start. I'm hoping like people are feeling like doing it. It's pretty straightforward, and I think the way you should look at it is really just this idea of like, how can you just have a second reading with like another maybe way of dealing with the subject. Because as I was saying, it's like I'm more, even though I try to tie it back to architecture, there's really this idea of like visualization, and basically like I love doing like critique and getting feedback and explaining things so that people have like generally most of the feedback I got from my feedback when I do like rendering teardown is like, oh yeah, I literally didn't see it that way. And it generally really helps in like the further work you do later, because you're like, oh yeah, and then he said this, so maybe if I try this way, and then you start trying new things that you didn't think was like would be worth trying. So so yeah, there's like 3 steps. We'll go very quickly to the 2 first because it's already a bit, and I filled you. Well, we don't have that many people, so that's good in a way. And the idea is just to sort of like analyze and refine intent. So look at your, like, as I was saying, like intent is very important. So just have a look at how you sort of looked at your project and understand if you were going deep enough in order to actually extract all the information that you needed to have like a refined design. Then the idea is to analyze and refine the design translation. So look at all your like plans and sections and see if there's something that is like sort of not making sense. As I was like explaining with the little example of like transparency and stuff, is like how you can have like this first intent of like, I want something that looks transparent, etc. But in the actual plan and how you design the project, it's sort of like got lost in other aspect of the design. And the last one, which is the one I think we'll spend most time on, is this idea of from that building that you designed and the intent that you have, how can we like choose a couple of views that would make sense to show in order to better convey the idea that you want to convey with your project. And here we can either start from like your last project, or like the project you're working on, and the visuals you have, or we can just like sketch stuff just to talk it out. And yeah, so one thing I can do is, so I've prepared like, just in terms of how it works, I've prepared like a Miro board where you can like sort of drop your images and stuff so that we can have a look at it and talk about it. And yeah, as I said, like there's not that many people, so maybe it's actually even better so that we can just literally have like a very simple conversation about your work, and so that you can get a different take on it, more like focused on visualization. Let me just find this. Sure.
Now, if people haven't like produced images yet for their final presentations, because they're at least another week or so away, you can just upload images that you did for your last semester's project or something like that, because it's sometimes worth just kind of going through the process of looking at something that you've done, even if it's a while ago, and kind of thinking about it in a fresh way. So don't feel pressured to whip something up in 10 minutes. Like put something up that you may have worked on before.
I'm gonna share the board. How do you do that here? Well, actually, no. If you join the board, that way you will see me directly, because it's.
Oh yeah, it's terrible on Zoom. Don't.
Yeah.
I learned this the hard way last semester. For anyone who was in my tutorial group last semester, it's disastrous.
So basically, I've put like how many? I don't know how many people were expecting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so I guess it's fine. So I've put like just a very quick board where the idea is like to, in the middle section, just put like your plans and sections, work in progress. Doesn't have to look good. It's just like the concept of it. And in the visualization part, just put like the 3D you've had so far. It can be like if you, depending on the project you chose, as Justin said, is like, if you just want to put some sketches or like 3D export that you have from your current 3D model, we can also do that and talk about it. It's like completely fine with me. It doesn't have to be refined. Or on the other hand, if you're more interested in like the like nitty-gritty detail thing, maybe take a project you finished so that we can show me like more refined visuals, so that then we can talk about those visuals more in like, and have like a higher level of detail so that we can talk about it. And so basically just choose like one board that is down and start like dropping in the content that you have. The top part is like for what you have, and the bottom part is more about refining what you had. And if you have any questions, of course, just don't hesitate. And I've put on top like a very quick example, just to like, this is like one of the things I use for like the workshop that I usually run. It's like one of the scenes where you can sort of see the sort of thing I mean. It's like just a plan in a couple of sections, and on the right it can be like work in progress visuals or like more refined images. And on the bottom I've like sort of like added some notes just to tell you, sort of like show like part of it will be done by yourself, as in like just revisiting your images and thinking about like this idea of contrast and idea of balance, and does it match my intent, etc. And then we can have a look at it together and sort of see how you can sort of like refine your images so that they fit a bit better what you actually wanted to show. And hopefully like the idea is that you sort of get a better grasp of like how this works, so that you can use it in your next set of images that you're going to have to do for your presentation in a couple of weeks. So yeah, just pick any of the templates that are like down, and you can start.
Maybe something we can talk through, Simon, while students are kind of assembling their images and the like, is this kind of intent page. So 2 very simple questions, really, which is the original brief of the project, or like the main aspects. so that it's essentially like a list of like key spaces or key, but it could be like key experiences or like something, I guess, maybe a bit more abstract or aspirational as well. Like if there's a particular view that the client is after, or for these students, like is particularly central to their project, that might be, part of like the brief, so to speak. And then the second part, the main ideas, that I think you've captured that really, like in a quite interesting way, because it's about relationships, or to a large part, it's about relationships, right? So relationship to the hill, how the access emphasizes landscape, how the entry is kind of hidden from view. Like these are not just like a list of places, that you're documenting their specific moments or views, or that become kind of central to the way that you tell the story about a design. I wonder, like, is the third step in that thinking about those types of like balanced and imbalanced images as well, like where like a particular like point in the landscape opens up a view, like, or how am I trying to say here? Like, would you then abstract like one step further to kind of get to those kind of some of those compositional types?
It's the way it's set that way, but it could actually be as like, basically when I'm working on the visualization, I will sort of skip the architectural design because I'm not in charge of it. So yeah, depending on what the client was trying to do, then as you say, it's like you can have like a particular point in the landscape that is important, or a particular like building in the context that you want to emphasize, and then that you're going to try to create a relationship.
But I guess yeah, once you know that, though, what I'm getting at is once you establish that those relationships are important, does that tend to lead you towards particular kind of compositional
images
types?
yeah no, of course. If it's some, there's the thing is that sometimes it's a bit, I mean, I don't think you'll have the case here, but it's like sometimes you have like the brief that has a certain like that puts a certain weight on some aspect of the brief, while the actual way the architect is dealing with the brief is they put the emphasis on something slightly different because they sort of discover something as they were working on the project. So this sometimes happens, like the end client is interested with something, but we want to show it, but we want to emphasize more this aspect. Because this is how we're going to differentiate ourselves on like from the other competing teams or something like this. So it's sort of have to juggle, but because sometimes like you can there's always the same thing as like in the same way of like balance and imbalance, like you have a relationship or you don't have a relationship, but it's also something that you can show is like we're not taking into account the existing. So it's still something that in terms of composition, it is an interesting take and that you can show. It's like we're completely like being completely oblivious to what is existing, and we're just like dealing with our own plot or something like this.
So for those students who are in the Miro board and participating in the tutorial, do you have any questions at this stage about the first activity? Feel free to speak up if you do. I know you're all a bit shy and you want to like either just get into it, or maybe you're sketching frantically about like what it is that you're going to do next. But by all means, this is an opportunity to chat with an expert in the field of visualization. So feel free to speak up, ask questions, get tips. Now's your time. So in your layout here as well, in the second section, Simon, where you've got architectural design, you've put in the plan and 2 sections of the project. Why were those images important here? Like, besides the obvious that they're the plans, were they the only images that were given to you by these architects, or why did you pick the plan sections?
In that case, it's like I made the project from scratch myself in order to have like all the elements myself for the purpose of the workshop. So it's not it's based on like some client work I've done in terms of like the process. But here it's like very just like in terms of information, because usually I don't like do workshops in like universities for architecture, so it's a bit different. Mm-hmm. Here, what is something I would have actually really liked to talk about is of the like the styling or stylizing of the actual CAD work, because there's a lot to be said about like how your plans look and how your section looks and what they will convey based on how you drove them actually. So here they're like pretty, I won't say basic because they're not basic. There's like already they're basically the amount of information I needed. But those were like more, because the thing is that one thing that I do also that is maybe worth mentioning that can be interesting for some of you is that I do always like a first step of exploration of the project in 2D by just looking at plans and sections, because you can normally already tell what will be the important or interesting places where you can potentially have nice shots for a project. So some people will dive straight into the 3D. I tend not to do it because I like to have like a better look at how the project is like internally working and get like a better understanding of the connections, etc. Because there's a big abstraction once you place the cameras that everything that is outside doesn't exist anymore. But at the same time, in the building itself, you still want to suggest what is going to happen. If there's like people that can enter from that door, if it's a door that people usually go out, if you can get a glimpse of what's happening behind, etc. And sort of like have a sort of image that can show the logic of that that functioning. So here we're on a like very tiny project. It's just like a simple house. So there's not much to sort of think about. You can't do like 60 different sections, or at least at this scale. But it's important to sort of know what you're showing and then choose the type of line that you want to use that sort of convey the fact that you're like maybe like depending on how you were treating, for instance, the hill is like if you have like a very like heavy line weight or not, it will show if you feel like you're like it will sort of inform on how you're touching with your building the existent, the context. And this is like this type of like, again, contrast and things like this that can sort of like show if the overall project is supposed to look heavy or supposed to look thin. If you look at, for instance, it's more like, or in terms of plans, for instance, if you want like, it's very odd to have plans with like your walls being cut with like very thin lines and actually being walls that are extremely heavy when you're in the space. So it's something you kind of want to translate is like if you have like a core in your like plan, you want it to be extremely visible in the plan because it's going to be extremely visible in the space and in the images you're going to make. And on the contrary, if you think of like works like Sana or people like this that are like very organic and light, if you look at their plans, they're usually very, very thin lines. And they have like, if they ever have like a core aspect of like something that is very strong in the plan, it will pop out a lot more because they will have like a line weight that works with it. And it's not necessarily the line weight is not like this. We have like this tendency of just thinking I cut through something, so line weight is 3, I don't cut and I see it, it's like 0.5 or whatever. The thing is, it also has to be visual, and the contrast that you're creating is going to inform if you're like, you can go above or even below to sort of emphasize the sort of values that you can get and the type of information that you can get from a plan or a section.
Yeah. I think that's worth keeping in mind as well, that just as there are no hard and fast rules in composition, only kind of relative decisions that kind of help to inform meaning. I guess like that's the same with your drawings. So the fineness of elements versus the heaviness of things can actually, the way they're rendered in the plan or in the section, also have something to say about the ideas informing the design. They may make no material difference in the resolution of the project, simply because, you know, lines are abstractions, not material things. But in the case of the communication of materiality, or the communication of an affect, they're really vital. It's interesting how that thinking from the creation of perspective images rendered out through software that you use makes sense as well. Just doesn't make sense for renderings, it makes sense for drawings.
Yeah,
So
and it was kind of
a
this discovery in a way. Even though I like always had it at the back of my mind, I was like having time to dig a bit deeper regarding this topic. I was like, yeah, there's actually a lot regarding just the graphic style that has to do with the same principles. And it's always it's fun because I remember like back when I was doing my thesis or like graduation project, is that there were like styles of like negative plans where like it's white line work on black background and things like this that are like very trendy. And at the same time, if you don't question why you should picture it that way or represent it that way, you might actually convey wrong information, because when you're dealing with that type of really like inverted representation, you actually have like something that looks way heavier, etc. and you're on your page, and like there's a lot of like it's called like unconscious things that happen in terms of perception, that if you're not aware of those, you're actually conveying wrong information about your project. And basically one of the key, or like the most basic one, is really relying on this idea of like weight, is like if you have a building that looks very heavy and actually you're not after that aspect at all, then you have to be careful to not depict it that way. So if you have like very heavy lines, or like everything is super black, etc., then it's actually convey the idea that the project itself is sort of thought in that way, even though you might not want it, but it's actually like how people will perceive it. So it's quite interesting, because there's a whole trend lately on like this type of axonometrics and things like this. And sometimes you can see this is actually the problem also regarding the sort of standardization of like visual identity or something like this, is that if you're doing very different types of projects, like logically you shouldn't be able to use the exact same visual style, because if they're like completely like conceived completely differently, they shouldn't be expressed the same way. But we have this way of like standardizing everything usually that sort of leads to like misconceptions or like misunderstanding sometimes. But it's quite interesting to notice.
Yeah, I think this is particularly the case with the kind of trend towards collaging of the last kind of nearly 10 years now, since those early kind of Gies Van Severen images came out, that every project now gets the same treatment, but it's actually not necessarily the best way of communicating. Even at a really simple kind of level though, like there's a local architect in Sydney, Andrew Burgess, who does like quite beautiful work. And one simple thing he does in his drawings is that he colors all his walls black most of the time for legibility, but then he will color in the joinery, like all the cupboards and stuff, black as well, so that you actually get a sense of what the negative space is, rather than the cupboards looking like void space. It's like just really simple little things like that actually turn a drawing from something just like a technical description of something into a proper kind of communicative device. So definitely something to kind of keep in mind. Those students who are in the Miro board, anyone got anything they want to talk through at this stage? Has anyone completed one part of the activity? It doesn't look like it. It looks like
no, they're too shy, or I don't know. But it's okay. We can do it like a different way if you want. If they want just to ask like questions or openly or anything, I mean, I don't mind.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions they want to go through, or like show an image that they've done previously and get some kind of feedback on it, or even just have a chat? You're more than welcome just to chime in with any questions you might have. This is I guess one of the challenges of online learning still, that it's easy to hide.
Yeah, it is. It's okay.
I don't know. I don't know what we do in this instance, but maybe what we can do is go through the example that you've given here. Maybe we can chat about each stage, and those who want to watch this back can kind of follow along and maybe do something similar. So we've talked a bit about the intent portion here, and how you've kind of moved from just a list of spaces through to a kind of experiences or relationships that you're trying to draw out, and then the drawings. And so the drawings are helping to like inform the kind of tectonic logic of the project, as well as the kind of the key aspects that you might want to draw out. So in this case, the kind of heaviness of the materiality of this like floating box. I guess its horizontality as well is like a thing that you want to draw out. So what comes next in this process is, I guess we're going to move to slide 3, but so tell us a bit about the logic of the visualizations.
Basically, like if we go from like the second to the third, it's more about like, it depends. Normally you will have like a set number of images. So here you're a bit more open and free because you're like students, and you can, as we were mentioning earlier, is like you can do as many images as you want, even though I would try to keep them like focused. And basically the idea is to sort of like create a sort of narrative around the project of like showing the things that you want to show. And basically it's like for each image you want to sort of capture the stuff you want to show. And you know, like there's always this thing where you have like the opposite problem with clients where they will like, can you show this, and there's like an endless list of things. And here the idea is like sort of like, what are the really important things you want to show, and what are the sort of best way of showing it? And then you can sort of see if there are other things that you need to show, if you can show them in a different way, in a different picture or something like this. And here, so having like, basically taking back on the terminology, is like having like intent and sort of writing it down of like, what are the actual things you want to show? And then starting, normally for like one type of like intent, you would go through like many images. The idea is always to iterate and have like many proposals. And then you just look at all the options that you have, and you're like, yeah, this one fits better. And then you keep on refining until you actually have like the perfect image, if I may say. So those images are like very basic ones. And the idea is to say, from those sketches, how do we refine them in order to better grasp or better convey what we're trying to show? And so basically the idea will be questioning the idea of frame, questioning the idea of lighting, questioning the idea of colors. Like, so is the lighting orientation making sense, or should I do I need to move it around in order to better emphasize one part of the project? Because as we talked about, this idea of like greatest area of contrast and how your eyes are led by light, what is going to happen with the light I've chosen. Also, just in terms of intent already, and you were talking about that earlier with the type of balance, is that depending on how you want your project to be experienced, you will have a certain type of balance you're after, which will then lead to a certain type of light that you want. There's like a very typical thing is that when you want like very not balanced, but like very calm image, etc., we tend to fall on stuff like aerial perspective and fog and things like this, so that you have something very atmospherical and where you're only focusing on very small details of the project. Whereas if you have like a completely clear day, you have like way more details in your face, and it's like, it's a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on how you want to depict your project, basically. So, and also depending on the scale. I mean, I don't know what your students are like working on in terms of program. But
Everything.
if you have like, yeah, but that's good actually. That's good in a way, because like those principles apply all the time, whatever the program or you're working on. It's just that your decision will be completely different based on the scale, based on the program, based on the way you're tackling the subject, etc.
Right. We've actually got someone in the comments, Maria, who has a preliminary sketch she'd like to discuss. Maria, are you there?
Yeah, hi, Justin.
How are you?
Hi.
Maria, would you like to share the sketch in the Miro board, or would you like to do it over Zoom?
Sorry, I can't hear you. Just trying to.
I was just saying, would you like to share the sketch in the Miro board so that we can kind of zoom into it there, or would you like to do it over Zoom and just share screen?
Yeah, let me just try and share it on the Miro board.
Okay. We will come find you.
Could you just send me the link again? I can't seem to find it in the chat.
Sure. Did that come through?
Yeah, just trying to upload it there.
No worries. Let us know when you've uploaded it.
Do you mind if I just share it here, because I'm not able to share it there?
That's fine. Yeah, go for it.
Could you please enable the sharing?
It is enabled.
Oh, okay. All right, so are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, so we're looking at a plan. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it's my site plan, and I've been trying this is the area of intervention for me. So, and it's I'm just trying to get my head around how to show the different timelines that are there. So, okay, so this is a site area, and I have different timelines in which I want to show different things that have been happening in this particular area. So
you're trying to show things that have happened like across different times of day or something like that in one image? Sort of, yeah. So I've been trying to get my head around how to visualize that, in terms of like the different sections. Yeah, that's a tricky question, Simon. You've been thrown a curveball. So instead of doing a single static image, you need to show things that happen across time in a single one. What would you start with? Would you be looking for references for how to do that, or would you be trying to like think of a different way of drawing this? Like, where would you start?
Well, when it comes to time and sequence, it's always not problematic, but it's always easier to have like different images so that you can like go through them and have like the evolution. But otherwise, it's just a matter of differentiating what is existing and what is not in something that there's like a type of concept that I didn't explain, but it's like the idea of like Gestalt theory is like how you relate objects that are like similar together. So for instance, if you have like all your elements in white, we can sort of understand that they're from the same phase. And if you have like another phase that is in a different color or even different opacity or whatever, you will already relate them together as well as if they were different or from a different time. And then, well, you always have this idea of needing to have like a, how's it called, like a caption and whatever. But it obviously is like a very specific question, but it's when it comes to like what's it called, like a phasing and things like this, it's generally just having like different colors and showing how like being able to understand like the shape or the overall shape of what's actually happening, so that you what becomes problematic is when you're destroying things, because this is like the case scenario where it's very complicated because you need to show something that's actually not there. And here in that type of case, you really have to go with different like several images in general.
Yeah, but so Maria, have you thought about doing several different images rather than trying to collapse it all onto one?
Sort of, yeah. So there were some sections that I've been developing over the time for the jetty. So I was kind of like trying to get my head around how to, show different sections in this plan, like probably at different, places, and each section has a different story to tell. Like it has different functionalities and different iterations that I have been designing. So just, I know it's like a very specific question, but is there any reference images or anything that you can,
Well, I guess you could do an animation, right? That would be the next step, would be to actually animate the image.
Yeah.
Simon, have you done much animation?
Well, animation for like 3D stuff, yes. Animation, like 2D things, I have to admit I'm not done doing it much, but it's definitely something that is like eye-catchy. Like anything, as soon as there's like motion and images, there's a lot of things happening that sort of like catches your attention and makes it like much easier to sort of understand what's going on. So it's pretty interesting as a thought experiment. In terms of section, I really like the idea of like having like, it's pretty simple, but it's still like very efficient. It's sometimes like straightforward ideas are like the way to go. Is like when you have like a very long project and you just like kind of slice it and you have like sort of like different narrative or stories happening in on each place is very, very interesting. I think then, for instance, just like when we're talking about this idea of contrast, is like how like juxtaposing those images is, or even just sections, but like this is still images in a way. It's interesting to see, because what was going to happen is that depending on how different they are, they're going to be more or less impactful. If, for instance, most of your jetty is actually, you're making several sections and they all look most of the time the same, then it's going to look like the project is very linear and simple. But if on the other hand, your like sections are very diverse and there's like a lot of changes in the way it looks or the way it's used, then what you need to do is to emphasize those aspects that are changing, basically. So if you can't juxtapose images of like the way your project is evolving, that's a good idea to juxtapose like small sections of the project and sort of really think about what you can emphasize in each of those sections. It has to be sort of a theme so that you can sort of like compare it, because if you're emphasizing completely different aspects, then we're going to have a hard time understanding what's the common denominator in the image. But if, for instance, as I was saying, it's like the use is different, or like there's a different way of using the space, or like different types of lighting or whatever, then you have to choose that theme and sort of make it the whole topic for each section, so that we can see more the difference and sort of gives more depth to your project in a way.
I think something else that you talked a lot about is an idea of contrast as well. I think this is something that can be applied to an image like this as well. Like, which elements do you render in color or in detail versus which parts do you show in your line work or like more abstractly. So right now you've got a lot of visual detail in the vegetation, and it shows us that there's vegetation there, but perhaps it's not the most important thing to communicate in detail. I don't know. Like, you could argue it both ways. You could argue that all you've done is provided texture, and it's just kind of allowing other things to stand out. So the buildings in white stand out against the colored background. But maybe there's something in that idea of contrast that you want to play around with.
I was kind of thinking that if I should define my site area and probably just select this portion and just turn rest into a monochrome kind of a scheme, so that the main site gets highlighted.
That would be one method of using contrast as well. It comes down to, go back to what Simon's been saying, like, it comes down to the intent and whether you want to show a relationship between your project and the water, or between your project and the town, or the vegetation. I guess, like, all that, there's all that content there. I guess it's a matter of kind of drawing out what are the key stories, narratives, arguments, concepts that you want to try and convey.
Right.
One thing just that sort of struck me at first is just there's actually still related to this idea of contrast, is that there's very low contrast between your jetty and the road, etc., and the rest of the image, meaning it actually doesn't pop out that much. So if the jetty is like an important part of your design, it might be interesting to see if you just need to brighten it. Sometimes, like, very simple stuff, maybe you need to darken it, or like you need to brighten the sea, even though it looks very nice like this. But there's like basically, as I was saying, it's like the lower the contrast you have between objects, the less you'll notice those objects. So if for you the jetty is like a very important aspect of the design, just like your building on the left, the fact that they're very bright on like a darker background, they pop out a lot. But the jetty, and like you have like this sort of I don't know if it's a building or whatever, with like the grid that is at the very beginning, as well as it's very subtly inserted in the surrounding. So basically it depends on what you want to show. If you just want to show like let's call it like the massing of the project, that it needs to pop out because you want to be able to understand how the project works. But at the same time, but on the other hand, if it's more about like how the project will be experienced on site, and that actually this jetty is very subtle and you actually don't even see it that much, and that first part is like half buried or whatever, and it's actually not like a big thing that you see in the landscape, then maybe it can make sense that it's very subtly inserted in the image itself. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve with the image. If it's just like how's it called, like a strategic plan, or like urban plan, or if it's more like something regarding like experiencing the space, or like the logic of the program, etc. Just like just clarifying this can help you.
A really interesting point as well, like that grid object at the bottom of the jetty is in much lower contrast than the existing buildings, which are drawn in white. And so it's even just like little tricks like that, like being able to control that level of contrast, it could be really helpful. I know that something that I've seen used, because I was watching like a couple of tutorials just on graphic design, because I kind of also interested in this kind of stuff, and the ways I can use it to improve my work, was just a technique of putting desaturating your entire image completely, just to check, just to see what it looks like when it's all black and white, and immediately you'll see the zones of high contrast versus zones where everything kind of blends into so one one tone.
Yeah.
So you might want to also just as you go through, check your levels, contrast levels, just by turning the image black and white just to see what it looks like.
Yeah, actually, I think that makes sense because so my focus area is actually this. So from what Simon just said, it kind of makes sense that it's not really highlighting, and probably the focus is going to this area, which I should change. So yeah.
Yeah. So Simon, one thing we haven't talked about is the different kind of color tools in something like Photoshop, or like not color tools, but like color formats. So you have like RGB, you have CMYK, you also have HSK, or sorry, HSL, is it right?
HSL, yeah.
Hue, saturation,
like hue, saturation, lightness, or light, whatever one's on
yeah,
or brightness.
And that's a kind of a different way of thinking about it as well, because then you're dealing with like color, the level of saturation, which is another kind of way of contrasting things, right? Like things that are in intense color versus
for sure.
things which are
RGB doesn't, well, it makes sense in terms of web design and informatic and things like this, but in terms of designing, it's you can't really work with it because it's, even though it's logical, but it's like way too abstract for people to understand. Like there's 60% of green and 30% of blue, and like you can't really picture what's happening. Whereas if you know saturation is very low, then you know it's going to be, well, very desaturated. If you know brightness is very high, and it's going to be very bright. And depending on the hue, like when you start knowing the degrees, you know what color it's going to be. And there's a whole thing of like how, like playing with contrast again, is like regarding colors, is like you can contrast basically those three things. You can have contrast of hue, you can have contrast of saturation, you can have contrast of brightness, but like the brightness of the color. And then you have like others that are like a bit more complicated because they're really based on like active perception, where it's like like simultaneous contrast with like it's something you look at and actually there's like the sort of like complementary color that bleeds in the one next to it, etc. And one thing that is the main thing that is fun to understand with colors is that they're very what's the word? Very like malleable. So if you look at, like, for instance, here we have everything looks a bit desaturated. So if you saturated just a single area in this image, it would look even more saturated because the rest is very desaturated. Or if you had like a pinch of like, I don't know, like orange or something like this, it would catch your eye a lot because you have a huge area of blue, and any complementary color from that would sort of like catch your eye because it's very different from the rest of the image, even if it's like just a small spot. That's why usually we use like red to indicate like a specific location on a planet, because there's usually no red on the rest of like in a context or whatever. So it's usually a colors that contrast enough in terms of hue so that you can notice it very quickly. In video games, it's usually more yellow for some reason. There was like an explanation for it, but I actually forgot it. But you have,
because
like,
yellow is
usually
kind of associated with like warning and
Yeah.
against, I guess, dark backgrounds, it's the primary color that stands out the most.
Yeah, it's like very bright colors. It's
but on a white background, you can't see it.
Unfortunately.
Well, it's just, again, it's a contrast thing, so you can't really get the levels of yellow. It can't really go past a certain point before it just becomes like brown. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it's the only color you can't really desaturate. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, interesting. Maria, thanks for that example. I think there's probably enough to go on there. I understand it's preliminary, but it's good to kind of get this feedback now, I think. So thanks for that. Simon, we've got about like 20 minutes left. Unless any other students want to show some work or anything, should we actually just go through one of like a Photoshop file or something like that, or something that you've been working on, and do a bit of a tear down here of how you kind of get the thing out of V-Ray and start post-processing it? we can talk about, I guess, some of the compositional elements there as well. Like, interested to hear your thoughts on how to place people, given that you made a point that people are often kind of higher contrast than everything else because your eyes are kind of drawn straight to them. So
it depends. If anybody has like a rendering that they want us to discuss, I think it could be a fun thing to do, just to sort of like try to expand from it and like all the topics possible. Otherwise, yeah, I can try to find a document that would make sense for it. So yeah, someone is bold enough to show his or her work, that would be fun. Otherwise, yeah.
Otherwise, I might need to find something in mind. God. You can tell me how terrible it is. I don't think we're going to get any volunteers. But that's okay. Right. That's all right. We can take an image.
Yeah. Maybe I have like one project that's quite simple that I can maybe try to explain a little.
That sounds great. Let's do that.
Let me find Photoshop file quickly. How's it called? Sorry. So yeah, let's do a 15 minutes explanation of a very quick project.
Let's do that.
How do I share my screen? I'll do it here, and I'll just this. So this was like a memorial in Ottawa in Canada. What I can show you very quickly is. I'll just double check that I have them. Yeah, like the tests we did at the very beginning and why we ended up with what we ended, and like sort of explain the process. I won't show it that way. Actually, what I can do is use this. Oh no, I won't do it that way. So basically, it's like this sort of like so it's I was called like a monument or whatever. So it's very simple shape, very simple to frame. The thing is that there was a lot of subtlety in the principle of like the way it was built, because there's like, we can't see it here because like very early draft, but there's like mountains because of the way there was like 3 different types of concretes that were like differently crushed or something. And it sort of like make a pattern that is like legible. So there was basically this idea of like trying to make this legible in the image, and also show how the sort of like grid system interact with light. It was like the 2 main ideas regarding the design itself. And then there was something regarding the fact that there's like the way that the project is not a project, but like the monument is positioned in the space or on the plaza, has to be like framing specific aspects of the context. So this is like the how is it called, like a ministry of something, I forgot. Sorry about that, but it's been a while ago. And so what I can, I think there was like, I don't have the first round, I'm sorry, actually, but those are like, generally it's at the first phase is always like try as many things as you can in different aspect ratio is better, or at least to know that you're going to try different aspect ratio later on, because it does have an impact on what is doable. The good thing with like such a straightforward project is that you kind of end up choosing things quite quickly. For some reason, we quickly went on like night aspect. I'll explain that in a minute. And on something basically also, as I was saying earlier, it's like you need to have your images need to compound in a way. They need to deliver more and more information as you sort of put them together. So we have one that is like very close in showing like the subtlety of the grid system and the sort of pattern they're using, or like I don't have the word for some reason. And something that is more about like the sort of atmospherical aspect of like something a bit more like also rare, because it's like a memorial, not a monument, it's a memorial. So it's like also this idea of like something like very calm and peaceful and blah, blah, blah. So you don't want to go with like super like harsh lighting. You don't want to go with like super dynamic framing, because it would sort of like defeat the purpose of something where you go to just like sit down and think and ponder and whatever. So this is why we went for like a couple of different options. These, for instance, sometimes you have like how's it called, like practical problems where there's so much context that you actually don't have, that you are trying to minimize the impact of the context. Like for instance, on this image, actually there's a building behind, but we said we're going to go with like a very foggy atmosphere so that you really feel like you're alone with on the memorial, and just like sort of like alone with your thoughts and whatever. So this basically is like this idea of how the context and the way you want to experience the space completely drives the almost the weather you want your project to be depicted in. And on the other hand, for this image, it's like the opposite. Is like there's a clear view that we need until the existing project, the existing building, because there's all this aspect of like framing and like emphasizing, etc. And also here you don't see it in this current image, but there was a whole topic, as I said, about how the light goes through those little holes. So you need like a clear day for that, because otherwise if the light is too diffuse, etc., then it becomes a bit problematic, because it doesn't actually go through. And on the other hand, also, what is interesting is that sometimes there's like realistical expectation and like the fact that, for instance, we want the light to be very low in order to go through those holes. But at the same time, if the light is very low, it means it's the end of the day. And generally when it's the end of the day, you have like either much warmer, you usually have much warmer tones, and actually having warmer tones is quite interesting, where you want something to still feel very inviting, because when you have something on the other hand that is very cold, well, as its name entails, like it's something that is not very inviting. So since it's like a memorial, we're playing on like an interesting contrast of like warm and cold, etc. So I'm just gonna open the Photoshop files that I don't have for some reason. That is nice.
That time of day actually is really a really interesting thing for Memorial. I'm not sure what it's like in France or in Spain, but there's a tradition in Australia on the equivalent of Veterans Day to have a service at dawn. So there's like a memorial ceremony that happens very early in the morning. And so if you want to talk about like the idea of memorial in the Australian context, actually the lighting at that time of day would actually be very important, because it has a kind of cultural significance to it. So that might be another part of the narrative that students might want to think about in terms of like lighting their images. Is there a particular kind of time of day where that has a particular meaning for their project?
Yeah. Of course. And also like just in terms of program is like when you're dealing with a program where something happens just at a specific time of the day or a specific time of the year, something happens more during winter or summer or whatever, it's something that can always inform your decision on the process. For some reason, I don't know why, but I don't have my Photoshop files, which kind of sucks. And it's kind of problematic, to be honest. I'll just double check another area very quickly. And then if I don't have it, we'll just work from the JPEG.
Now, a lot of students are also picking up on Lumion and Enscape because they're very accessible rendering tools and interface quite well with Revit and Rhino. Are there any tips and tricks they might want to think about early on when setting up those rendering apps, just to kind of make to have a good workflow, or a couple of things that like are really important to have right at the beginning, so that you kind of give yourself the best chance, even if you're fairly new to this, to kind of get a good image?
I think the main thing is to just like leave no stone unturned. So like really explore all the camera point of views like that could potentially be interesting, and make sure to explore different lighting for each point of view, because sometimes one point of view will look like very underwhelming, but under certain light condition, it will suddenly be way more interesting than when you anticipated. So there's really this idea of you need to work like that way. Like one thing, like just to give you like the sort of practice I have, is that I have like a whole automated system where basically for every single camera, I have like the whole daylight system. And then I have like a contact sheet where I have all my light studies. And then I can be like, all this part is like garbage, I don't need it. But in some aspect, in like some hours of the day, there are like interesting things that are happening. So I'll take those and like study them further in order to see what could potentially be done with them. And this is I think it's a good thing it really depends on what are again, your intent at the very beginning. But if you're going for like very simple image, if I may say, it's more about like framing and lighting and being able to find the most adequate scenario that better gives the look you're going for. I'm just gonna.
And do you find that different lighting conditions or different approaches to lighting have particular impacts on the balance as well? Or sorry, is there a relationship between like lighting and balance that starts to come out, or do they kind of remain two separate things in your mind?
You know, they completely are. Like when you let's see.
This is also quite beautiful. Like you see the light coming through the screen. So I can see why this time of day was important.
Here, so that you can see the evolution. Definitely there are like literally times of day, types of seasons that will convey completely different things. Like as I was talking about colors, for instance, there's mere fact of doing images in winter, for instance, means that you're going to have like a much colder color palette. But at the same time, what is interesting is that once your color palette for like the exterior part is very cold, but it means that your building, once it's like lit from the inside, or depending on the material that you're dealing with, it's going to be like popping out a bit more by like color contrast. On the other hand, if you have like one of the hardest scenario in a way is actually to have like a perfectly blue sky, because you have like a very saturated sky that is like a very annoying color, if I may say. You have very harsh contrast and sharp shadows, which means that you have like a lot of highlight and a lot of like dark areas, and it becomes very complicated. So also one thing that is important, or not important, but like there are many rule of thumbs like this. One of them that is fun is that actually it's kind of counterintuitive, but if you have a building or space that is about color, the best way to have the most saturated and good looking colors is actually to have like an overcast lighting scenario, because the fact that you have like a soft light means that you're getting most of the saturation out of all the object, whereas if you have like very sharp shadows, it means that you have like a big chunk that is like in the shadow and the saturation is going down, and you have a big part that is in the sun and the saturation might go down or might go up depending on the actual color. There's like a lot of gymnastics to do with the actual color because they all have their inherent way of working. So definitely it's like, the thing is, you, as I was saying earlier, it's like how can I say, it's iterative process, and you just have to sort of like analyze your intent and have a hierarchy of like what is really important you want to show. So
can you take us through this image and like in terms of like the basic principles that you know, after going through that iterative process and kind of working on this, like what makes this a good image? Because it's a beautiful image, but just like what are the kind of key things that are working really well?
So in terms of like composition, if I take again the principles we had earlier, is like there's a lot of things that is happening when I say, so in terms of like what we wanted to show, there was like this aspect of like showing this element here. If you remember, maybe I talked about this idea of like the frame within the frame principle. So as soon as you have like high contrast like this and this create a sort of frame, it actually helps in focusing your attention on this aspect. Also, just in terms of communication, again, there was like the fact that we could read the sort of granite, whatever, texture a bit more because you couldn't see it from the other images that we kind of talk about in 5 minutes. And also there's like a lot of the idea of like the contrast between the heaviness of the project and the very open area here. So if we had like, again, elements that were here, it would feel like very enclosed and not open. Whereas the fact that we have something very open on the left helps in having this sense of, well, basically openness. One thing though that I could mention is that in terms of reading, we generally read from left to right. So when you read from this, you actually end up on something that is a bit like heavy. And if we flip that image, which I guess I can have something here, flip canvas, you can see that you have a completely different way of reading it because you're starting from the heavy part and you're going into the light part. So it's something you need to keep in mind. Like, I mean, here we couldn't flip it or not because it's actually like physically the thing is placed that way. So it's a bit like you can't play around with it. But sometimes when you're dealing with like a very simple scene, like you have how can I say, like a wall with a window, and whether you put yourself on the left or on the right, and you have like a wall that closes your image on the left or on the right, it completely changes the way you feel the opening because you're generally reading from left to right. So it's the type of like perception stuff that you need to have in mind. Regarding the image again, so this is, I mean, I'm just going to go through like the evolution. So here was mostly like, here you can see that the things were not legible. So whereas it was one of the most important aspect of the image. So most of the adjusting was about making the little beehive thing legible, and also making this sort of like mountain thing legible, even though it was on another image. And also having this very nice moire effect or like moucharade thing happening that sort of like makes things interesting. And then generally when you start aiming towards the final images, the changes are like super tiny. So there's nothing much happening. I mean, in terms of a huge difference, but that's the thing. And that's why I was saying earlier is like refocus on composition, because I mean, between this image, or let's say this image and this image, or like three steps further, there's almost no difference. It's just like tiny details that I'm correcting. It literally doesn't change anything in a way. But all the basics were already there at the very beginning. It was just here the light was not correctly emphasizing the project, basically. And then you have a lot of things like what we call like aerial perspective, like atmospherics that make things a bit more interesting because you have a better sense of depth. Also, we have like this sort of what's the word, experience of like walking around in the morning and having this sort of like haze going that's sort of like really have this typical light that most people I think have experienced in their lives. And also the fact that you're like, just physically speaking, you're on like you have the grass, so it tends to like release the water in the morning because of the sun, etc. So you have this sort of like stuff happening that creates interesting contrast. And what happens is that because we have lower contrast in the back, it means that we bring back the attention on the foreground that has, since it's in the dark, it has more contrast and it sort of like pops out a bit more.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter that the background's actually quite light.
Yeah,
it
exactly.
Still kind of recedes because the contrast is
this guy
much
actually
less.
is too dark. It should be like this part is actually, it should be slightly brighter. And another thing that is fun is that it's what we call like aspective view, is even if you have small silhouettes like this, they actually catch quite a bit of attention because you're having like this sort of line plus the people plus this element plus the fact that it's here. So there's like a lot of composition elements that make this area of the image be extremely heavy in the composition itself, even though it's actually just like 30% of it and the whole rest is actually just people looking at it.
One other thing I've noticed with this image, like immediately noticed, is that it's actually a single point perspective, but the single point is not in the middle of the image.
True.
So you don't read it frontally. It's still converging lines, but it shifts your view. So you're drawn to the center, but you notice the people all kind of aligned, looking towards that point as well. Like there's a lot going on to balance that image.
Yeah, it's something I'm not say I discovered it, but I'm using it more and more because of like a bit more aware of how I am of some aspect of composition. Is that we're used to use like tilt shifters to sort of like have verticals looking vertical and like having our building, like tall building, being visible, and we tend to forget that there's also like horizontal tilt shifters. And what they help in doing is that you can have, as you said, a frontal view, but shift the vanishing point on one side or another, so that potentially, because the problem is like sometimes you want to have your axis very legible, but at the same time you want the information that is in like one extreme that is not by default visible. So here what is interesting is that you can you can actually shift this. I don't know if it's like available in Twinmotion and things like this, but in like stuff like V-Ray at least it is. And I can go quickly on the other image.
Well, I guess you could render it much wider and then crop the image in Photoshop, and you would get a similar kind of effect.
Yeah, it could be like, physically speaking, it would work. It's just, you would need like a much wider lens.
Yeah.
And also a much higher resolution. This one is interesting because the first shot was extremely cold, and it sort of defeated the purpose of having something that is kind of warm and inviting, because when you have something like cold, as I said, it's like just not the most inviting thing. So this one, there was like basically the project in itself. So there's like this idea of the mountains that we're supposed to read. That is not the case yet. There was like a single line of a LED light that was like taking the people from like all the other end of the plaza up until this space, and then it was just like vegetation. So pretty simple setup that evolved quite quickly. Yeah, you can see like the difference between the first and the last one is, well, let's go to. So the main idea is like when you're having a frontal view with very little information around, basically this becomes very quickly the center of attention. And when something is the center of attention, you need to have like decent detail. If this was like a white rectangle with nothing on it, this would be a very boring image because there's literally nothing happening. Whereas if you start working the lighting properly, you start having, here we had like depth with like the stuff happening behind. We had like the little mountains and the people in front. after a bit of discussion, because of this image, we started, sometimes you have like a little issues of when the different planes are not legible properly, then you start having like this element that doesn't read properly because of the plans behind. So in the end, we decided to basically tone it down all the way to basically just turning it off. Actually, turning it off was the good call, because that way we really emphasize this aspect, and we focus on like silhouettes that are like sort of like just moving around. We still have this element in the foreground that really leads your eye with like the sort of straight line where it perfectly acts like on the axis of the symmetry of the overall building. We're still suggesting like the vegetation around, so that we are still connected to the other image that we have here, and we understand that it's like the continuation of the park that is around us. We have here like small details. That's always something that is quite fun, is like when you're, even if it's like very small scale, here you can see it sort of catches a bit. Actually, it should have been slightly darker, I think, but you still have this sort of small detail that you can suggest with like the place of stuff like written, etc. So, and the final image, well, it was the final image already. So very like, that's the funny thing, is when you're like dealing with very simple shapes, it's actually all about lighting. And if you want to sort of isolate the subject, it's more about like getting rid of the surrounding. So very short explanation.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's just those like little things about lighting or those little bits of detail that kind of make the image really clear, and the kind of concept behind the project really legible. Simon, it's 8 o'clock our time, which means it's time to wrap it up.
Yeah.
You've got some videos on YouTube which students can go watch as well, on different kind of on some of your teardowns. So I'd encourage them to do that. For those looking to kind of to improve their visualization techniques, which artists, photographers should they start looking at?
Well, it depends. There's like funny thing is like Ansel Adams wrote quite extensively about his process. It's outdated, but the composition part is actually quite nice. One of my favorite architectural photographers, like Julius Schulman, who does very
Schulman's beautiful work. Yeah,
very nice stuff, and they're very like properly organized. But one thing I would like say, even though it's like just for the visualization aspect, not the architectural one, is to try to look at more like paintings and look at stuff that you might find interesting for like color palettes or the way they look more for the light and things like this. And also this idea of when you look at something, try to deconstruct it. One exercise I tell people to do that is very simple, is that just the next time you go walk in the streets, you try to mindfully pay attention to what you're paying attention to. And then you start seeing that your eyes are like drawn to stuff without you even wanting it, because of like the fact that like cars moving like catches your attention, or there's like people, or there's like a special like light happening or something like this. And it starts to sort of make you a bit more aware of like how your eyes are working. And it's very like the whole point, I think, is to try to make things intuitive so that you can easily put them back into your workflow. So even when you're like designing a plan or a section, you can sort of be like, oh, this looks not out of balance, but like this looks way too heavy than what I want, or this looks way too dark, and blah, blah, blah. And also have this little diagram that I showed of like the fact that when you look at an image, it's really the conjunction of like color, frame, and light, and to understand what is doing what. Because maybe, as I was saying, it's like you can always compensate something with something else, which is quite nice when it comes to feel like you're free to experiment. And that's why I went like kind of against not against, but like the rules of thirds and all those like grid systems, is that they really put you in a very like simplified world, whereas actually you can experiment with many different options that are still like suitable for the way you want things to be expressed, basically. So I would try that. And if I have like one thing, like if you're really interested in composition for some reason, or composition or visuals, just look at like matte painting stuff. They, for some reason, they have way more courses than ArcViz on the subject, because ArcViz people are way too focused on photography, whereas matte painting people are really interested in paintings and like the history of how things happen, because they're literally still painting. So you will have like many good bases to start from and sort of question yourself, or like your practice and your like sort of fine tune your eye for things. So I guess it's a good things to take, like even 10 minutes a day just to think about it.
Yeah, those little habits are really helpful. Simon, thanks again for a really fascinating talk and a great discussion. Yeah, maybe we spoke too much, but I think
I hope like it's always the same as like I really hope there's like just a couple of things that interested people and that they can use later on, even if it's like, it sucks that it took me 2 or 3 hours to explain it, but even if it's just a couple of tips, it's always great. So
I gave you a pretty big challenge to say, take us through it in 3 hours.
yeah. So I hope people learn some stuff. So
yeah,
I'm glad they did.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Simon, stay on the line. I'll keep you to do a debrief. But everyone else, Thanks very much for joining us tonight. I hope you
thanks
learned
everyone.
Something from the talk, and it'll be up online, so you'll be able to watch it again and listen to us old guys talk about stuff. Thanks everyone. Thanks Toby for your thanks, and we'll see you in class on Friday. All right. See you later.